Hey everyone, per your requests, I'm starting Sword of Coming, chapters 411 through 420 of the previous episode. Before long, the duo uncovers a dark conspiracy within the fort, a plot by a sinister elderly cultivator, and a rogue immortal from Peace and Tranquility Mountain to nurture a demonic ghost infant inside the fortress lord's wife. Resolving to intervene, Jian utilizes his potent martial arts techniques and flying swords, successfully neutralizing the demonic threat and aiding the souls of the innocent children trapped by the Yin energy. Although the fortress lord's wife tragically perishes, the crisis is ultimately averted. To repay Jian Ping'an for his aid, the fortress gifts him halting snow, an ancestral blade that Jian promptly sells to Lu Tai for 20 grain rain coins. With peace restored, Lu Tai decides to settle in the Flying Eagle Fortress, while Jian Ping'an bids him farewell and continues his journey north through Parasol Leaf Continent. If you're able to, please support me on PayPal to help me stay active. Thank you. Now let's get back to the story of Sword of Coming audio series. Chapter 421. According to the Mountain and Sea Chronicle, there were many mountain gods and spirits on Parasol Leaf Continent, and this was indeed the case. During his travels, Jian Ping'an was actively avoiding places abundant with spiritual energy or clearly harbored hidden perils, but he was still unable to keep himself completely out of harm's way. For example, one night, he spotted a brightly lit city. He had no map as the distribution of maps was strictly monitored in all empires, even more so than weapons, and he wanted to replenish some supplies, so he followed the lights and made his way toward the city. The city had no curfew, but there were guards at the city gates, checking for passports. Upon entering the city, Jian Ping'an tried to rent a room in an inn, but the innkeeper refused to give him a room, telling him that he wasn't using the right currency. Each nation had its own special copper coins, so if Jian Ping'an had tried to pay using copper coins, then it would have made sense for him to be turned down, but it was rather strange that the innkeeper was refusing to accept silver. Thankfully, the innkeeper gave Jian Ping'an some instructions to a place where he could exchange gold and silver for the local currency, and he could come back once he secured the required currency. Jian Ping'an followed the instructions and made his way to a shop with an extremely tall counter that was close to 1.5 times the height of a grown man. Jian Ping'an stepped onto a small stool in front of the counter and stated the purpose of his visit, then submitted a few silver ingots in exchange for a bunch of copper coins and paper money. The copper coins appeared to be of good quality, and the paper money had official imperial court and bank seals on them, so Jian Ping'an accepted them without a second thought and returned to the inn. There, he paid for a room, then displayed his passport to the innkeeper upon request, and the innkeeper made some careful records of the provided documentation. The next day, Jian Ping'an was about to leave the inn when the innkeeper looked up from his abacus with a smile and informed Jian Ping'an of a tradition of the city. As it turned out, the word paper was not to be uttered here, and anyone who broke this rule would be kicked out of the city. All of a sudden, it began to rain, and Jian Ping'an sought shelter in a dilapidated pergola on the mountain. While practicing his walking meditation, he just so happened to take a glance in the city's direction, and he was astonished to discover that it was melting away in the rain as if it were a burning candle. Jian Ping'an hurriedly pulled out everything that he had bought in the city, as well as the copper coins and paper money, and his skin instantly began to crawl. As it turned out, they were all things cut out of paper to be burned as offerings for the deceased. Someone suddenly burst into laughter within a wall of the pergola, as if they were amused by Jian Ping'an's shock and disgust, and their eerie laughter echoed throughout the pergola. Jian Ping'an was surprised by the strange happenings in the city, but he wasn't fearful of ghosts and spirits. Hence, he was completely unfazed by the eerie laughter ringing out within the pergola. He sat down onto a bench in the pergola that had been crafted out of an old tree, then cast his gaze toward the wall as he drank in silence. Unless he had run into terrible luck and encountered a powerful great demon or an extremely formidable devilish cultivator that was adept at disguising themselves, the alternative was that he was most likely dealing with a weaker spirit. The average mortal would still be terrified of such a spirit, but for Jian Ping'an, an entity of that caliber posed no threat at all. The entity in question was still wholly unaware that it was biting off more than it could chew, and it put on an even more sinister voice to try and intimidate Jian Ping'an as it asked, "You're not afraid of me?" Jian Ping'an strapped his sword nurturing gourd to his waist, then rose to his feet and slowly made his way over to the wall before slapping a treasure pagoda demon-suppressing talisman onto it. A pleading voice that sounded as if it belonged to a child instantly rang out from within the wall, and Qian Ping'an smiled as he asked, "Should I be afraid?" "No. I'm the one who should be afraid," the entity in the wall hurriedly replied. "Come out. If you keep hiding from me, I won't be so nice anymore. Tell me what's going on with that city." Qian Ping'an removed the demon-suppressing talisman from the wall, then tucked it back up his sleeve and sat down onto the bench again. A fearful-looking boy emerged from the wall, and there was a mandarin square embroidered onto both the front and back of his clothes. However, unlike the colorful mandarin squares worn by officials from mortal imperial courts, his ones were only black and white. He stood in the corner of the pergola in a timid fashion, and he extended a bow toward Qian Ping'an, then declared his own identity. As it turned out, he was a mountain lord that had been appointed by the previous dynasty. After the change of dynasties, he was automatically made redundant, and without his status as a mountain lord, his already lowly cultivation base suffered even further. He was once the beloved son of a border general, but he died before even turning 7 years of age. One time a traveling immortal just so happened to be passing through, and he helped the boy's father turn him into an unofficial mountain lord, so that he could protect the feng shui of the clan's ancestral grave. However, all of that changed with the fall of the dynasty. This wasn't a significant event in history, but looking back it was a rather interesting one. Qian Ping'an asked the boy about the origins of the city, and the boy told him that the entire city of over 10,000 residents had perished in a single night due to a horrific man-made disaster many years ago. In order to avoid mass panic, the imperial court ordered all of the surrounding secrets to keep the event strictly confidential, and a high-ranking Buddhist monk was also recruited to perform a ceremony, preventing the city from transforming into a ghostly wasteland. Qian Ping'an asked the boy what was going to become of the city after the storm, to which the boy smiled and replied that all it would take would be a few rainless days for the city to make a full recovery. Qian Ping'an squatted down and burned the paper money in the pergola while facing the city, and the boy squatted down beside him as he mused, "You're a kind man, esteemed immortal." Qian Ping'an merely smiled and offered no response. He took the opportunity to ask the boy about the layout of this area, particularly about where there were any immortal clans or ferry stations nearby, and the boy told him everything that he knew. According to the boy, there were some evil forces that had claimed the mountain around 400 kilometers to the north, but they didn't do anything nefarious like kidnapping the nearby residents, so it was a relatively safe area with very few stories of people going missing or suffering untimely deaths. During their heyday, the evil forces there were so formidable that even many qi refiners passing through the area had to go around the mountain, but there had since been a change of circumstances, and it was said that only a few straggling spirits were left on the mountain. As for whether this was actually the case, it was hard to say. There were all types of rumors that were circulating, with some proclaiming that the evil forces there had been wiped out by immortals of planchette writing sect, while others proclaimed that the demons on the mountain had made the mistake of irking a Buddhist practitioner that just so happened to be passing through, thereby leading to their demise. Qian Ping'an was rather surprised to hear this. Even now, the mountain path in the Great Li Empire where he had encountered the female ghost in the red wedding dress was still clear in his mind. There were some dead leaves in the pergola, and Qian Ping'an and the boy gathered them together before using them to stoke the fire, then squatted down beside the fire together. The boy appeared to be quite youthful, but in reality, he had already lived for 500 years, and he explained to Qian Ping'an, the leader of the demons on that mountain had a relatively benevolent personality, so he never targeted me. Of course, there were many less benevolent figures among his subordinates, but all of them were very careful about maintaining good reputations. Otherwise, if it became widely known that they had been committing evil deeds, then people could start coming after them, and that could lead to a great deal of trouble, so none of them targeted me either. Qian Ping'an nodded in response. The boy held his hands over the flames as he continued. What is a demon to do in that situation? If they kill whoever comes after them, they'll only attract more and more self-proclaimed heroes pining for their heads. Eventually, they'll either be killed or be forced to kill so many assailants that the local authorities will report the matter to the imperial court. For fear of losing face, the emperor would then have to recruit the services of a powerful immortal. It really is all a huge pain. Qian Ping'an smiled as he said, If this isn't the case, then the entire world would have already spiraled into complete chaos. How would mortals be able to live? Over 10,000 people died in that small city alone. What are their friends and family outside the city going to think? With so many people dying overnight, the living will inevitably become fearful. The boy faltered slightly upon hearing this, seemingly having never considered this problem. After that, the boy told Chan Ping'an about many of the interesting stories from around these parts, most of which he had heard from others. After all, he had already lived for several centuries, and he had to find some ways to pass the time. After the rain subsided, Chan Ping'an bade farewell to the mountain lord and continued on his journey, leaving the boy on his own in the pergola. There was also one time when Chan Ping'an had passed through a graveyard, where he encountered a group of scholars on their way to the capital city for the imperial examination. They were standing in front of a large grave with inferior and awestruck looks on their faces when two pristine white foxes jumped out from between the graves, then got up on their hind legs and extended bows much like humans would. There were also several younger foxes that scurried onto the grave with very humanized looks of longing and shyness in their eyes. They didn't appear to be sinister spirits at all. Instead, they were like a group of playful children. The scholars returned the bow, and Chan Ping'an was rather amused to see this. He knew that these fox demons were tricking these scholars, but he wasn't overly concerned about this. Generally speaking, no fox demons on any continent engaged in barbaric activities. Instead, they had always tried to get close to humans, mostly for the purpose of overcoming the hurdle of mortal relationships to advance their cultivation base. Hence, Chan Ping'an made no effort to expose their scheme and reveal to the scholars that the grandiose manner that they were seeing was actually nothing more than a grave. Instead, all he did was silently wait beside the grave, and sure enough, as the group of scholars left the grandiose manor the next day, all of them were looking ecstatic, having just enjoyed the time of their lives the night before. Chan Ping'an departed with an amused smile. Around 150 kilometers later, he reached a small nation by the name of Northern Jian Nation. While passing through a city, he just so happened to enter a market, and he really did purchase a pair of tonghulus there. He had heard that Northern Jian Nation had a vastly renowned Tathagata temple, where there was a large rock that was said to have been one of the places where a bodhisattva had attained enlightenment. The rock was called the Stone Lotus Platform, and it was large enough to fit hundreds of people at once, yet just a single person was enough to make it wobble, a phenomenon that no one could explain. After verifying the authenticity of this phenomenon in person, the emperor of Northern Jian Nation had been very pleased, and that only further elevated the reputation of the temple. However, even after asking many people in the city, he didn't find a single one who knew of this Tathagata temple. Only then did he recall that the boy had told him that this had happened roughly 200 years ago, and 200 years was enough time for many things to change in the mortal world. After some hesitation, Chan Ping'an decided to persist with his endeavor, and in the end, he really was able to find the site of the Tathagata temple. He paid the temple a visit to find that it was overrun with tall grass and was completely deserted, making for a rather bleak and sobering sight. Under the dying light of dusk, he found a giant rock, but wasn't able to see anything remarkable about it. After finishing his last tonghulu, he discarded the stick before departing. Not long after Chan Ping'an left the dilapidated temple, a small figure poked their head out from behind the giant rock, then sat onto the rock in silence. As it turned out, the truth behind why the stone lotus platform wobbled was that a mischievous stone spirit in the form of a tiny lotus figure liked to hide inside it. Whenever someone attempted to shake the huge rock, it would immediately sway from side to side in an excited fashion, and the rock would sway side to side with it, thereby resulting in the misconception. However, one day it grew bored of this game, and from that point onward, the stone lotus platform only swayed occasionally whenever he was in the mood to play. Eventually, the rock stopped moving altogether as the stone spirit had left it to travel far and wide in search of a companion. Having been alone its entire life, it was feeling lonely. In the end, it managed to find two companions, namely a snake spirit and a deer spirit. The pure-hearted stone spirit was swindled by these two companions into handing over one of its arms and one of its lotus flower petals. However, it was still determined to find a companion, and ultimately, it found a flower spirit that didn't ask for anything from it. It took her back to the stone lotus platform, and they played together and pranked the tourists together. However, one day, it woke up to discover that the stone lotus platform had been completely drained of its spiritual energy, and the flower spirit had also disappeared. After that, the stone lotus platform gradually fell into obscurity until it was forgotten altogether, and all that remained was the little stone spirit with one arm left, sitting on the edge of the platform while gently swinging its feet back and forth. It would occasionally feel sad as it didn't know whether its 3 companions were currently doing well. If they weren't doing well, then why didn't they come to see it so that it could console them? If they were doing well, then why didn't they come to see it so that they could celebrate together? All of a sudden, the stone spirit turned to discover a white-robed figure sitting on the other end of the rock, drinking while facing the setting sun. Upon noticing its gaze, the white-robed figure flashed it a smile, and the stone spirit was so frightened that it immediately sprang to its feet before vanishing into the giant rock. Qian Ping'an burst into laughter as he jumped down from the rock, and only then did he truly leave the Tathagata temple. Only after hiding in the rock for a long while did the stone spirit dare to poke its head out once again, and after looking around to ensure that the white-robed figure was no longer around, it made its way over to where the figure had been sitting before. There, its eyes widened at the sight of the coin that had been left on the rock. Most spirits in the world like to consume immortal currencies for sustenance, and Qian Ping'an had left the stone spirit, a snowflake coin, as a gesture of goodwill without expecting any reciprocation. However, Qian Ping'an had only just left the city and made his way into the mountains when he spotted the stone spirit standing on the path up ahead, looking at him with tear-filled eyes while holding the snowflake coin. The stone spirit seemed to be both elated and a little uneasy at the sight of Qian Ping'an. Qian Ping'an slowly made his way toward the stone spirit, but the stone spirit has always been quite timid, and it instantly vanished from the spot. It continued to follow Qian Ping'an from afar, disappearing whenever he got too close, and before long they had traveled several dozen kilometers together. At this point, Qian Ping'an no longer made any attempt to approach it, merely allowing the stone spirit to follow him at its own pace. Soon, Qian Ping'an entered the forest that the boy had told him about, and the terrain in the forest really was very precarious. As he was about to emerge from the forest, he encountered a seemingly deranged spirit that was stumbling along in tattered clothes while murmuring to itself over and over again in a dejected voice, "How could someone so cruel have become a Buddha? How could someone so cruel?" The stone spirit was so terrified at the sight of the deranged spirit that it rushed over to Qian Ping'an and hid behind his leg. From that point onward, all of the wariness that the stone spirit harbored toward Qian Ping'an completely disappeared, and it was either skipping along beside him or sitting on his shoulder. After that, Qian Ping'an and his new companion passed through a war-torn nation that had been ravaged by tragedies, forcing a group of heroes to go rogue and forcibly take over the nation to end all of the suffering. During his time in that nation, Qian Ping'an heard countless stories about the heroic deeds of those 36 men, about their incredible generosity, which was matched only by their exceptional martial arts ability and superhuman strength. Of course, Qian Ping'an didn't believe all of the stories, but he certainly wasn't opposed to meeting these heroes should the opportunity ever arise. Even if they weren't willing to drink with him at the same table, he was content just to have some of their heroic spirit rub off on him from afar. Qian Ping'an went to seek out these heroic men, and in doing so, he was guided to an unscrupulous restaurant that sold human meat steamed buns. The group of merchants that he was traveling with all fell unconscious, so he pretended to do the same as well, and he was tied up before being carried to the back of the shop, where he was thrown onto a long chopping board. After that, a waiter made his way toward them, yawning while brandishing a boning knife. Over in a nearby city, an executioner was just about to lop off the head of a bandit when several dozen people stormed onto the execution site, led by an imposing man wielding a pair of axes. He chortled loudly as he chopped and sliced his way through the crowd, killing everyone in his path, regardless of whether they be soldiers or spectating citizens. Only receiving a scolding from a short, dark-skinned man did the axe-wielding man sheepishly stop his rampage, and all of the killing intent was drained out of his eyes. The dark-skinned man took a glance at the axe-wielding man, then waved a hand to dismiss him. A weary look then appeared on the man's face, but it was outweighed by relief and elation. He had put on a very stern and scathing demeanor while scolding the axe-wielding man, but there was currently a smile playing on his lips as he watched the axe-wielding man trudge away. After saving the fugitive that was about to be executed, The group of men got onto the horses that had been prepared nearby in advance, then rushed out of the city, and none of the soldiers dared to go after them. After leaving the city, the group of men were in a very jovial, celebratory mood as they made their way into the restaurant that they owned, only to find that the familiar couple there was missing. Instead, there was only a white-robed young boy with a long sword placed on the table in front of him. Shortly thereafter, Chan Ping'an left the restaurant, having put an end to the lives of most of the men in there. They had all been regarded as heroes in the eyes of the general public, and they did indeed die heroic deaths, with none of them begging for mercy or fleeing for their lives. As for the men who were spared, most of them were very quiet, or immediately disengaged themselves from battle after suffering even the slightest of injuries. They didn't curse Chan Ping'an, nor did they look as if they had any intention of seeking vengeance. Instead, there had only been a lost and disoriented look in their eyes, as if they were wondering what life decisions had led them up to this point. Chan Ping'an paid no heed to any of them. After leaving the restaurant, Chan Ping'an found the herd of horses by the side of the street, and he picked out one of them before jumping onto its back in an expertly fashion. Initially, he was rather shaky on horseback, but it didn't take him long to acclimate. What Chan Ping'an failed to anticipate was that this journey would take him half a year to complete. It wasn't because the observing Tao temple had been too far away. Instead, it was because Chan Ping'an had followed Lasting Chi's instructions and walked in circles in a majestic city for 3 whole months without finding the so-called observing Tao temple. In the capital city of Southern Garden Nation, Chan Ping'an asked everyone that he could, including merchants, soldiers, traveling martial artists, leaders of escort agencies, and officials from local authorities, but none of them had heard of this observing Tao temple. Chan Ping'an also read through all types of historical records, local chronicles and private records, but none of those had yielded any leads either. The only thing that he had to show for his efforts was that he was now fluent in the official dialect of Southern Garden Nation. Late autumn gave way to winter, which then transitioned into spring, and only at the beginning of summer was Chan Ping'an able to ascertain that the entrance of the observing Tao temple was right in this capital city, but he still wasn't able to find it. Even with his immense mental fortitude, he was starting to waver and grow a little frustrated. During this time, Chan Ping'an encountered many strange sights and stories. One night, he saw a hovering azure dress drifting through the air, as if it were draped over the body of an invisible dancer. One time, he unintentionally saw through an illusion, and he witnessed a section of the inner city's city wall that was supported by human remains, and every single brick had Buddhist scriptures inscribed upon them. He also encountered a traveling monk, which was a rare sight in Eastern Treasured Vile Continent. Buddhism was much more prevalent in Southern Garden Nation, and there were Buddhist temples everywhere. From this traveling monk, Chan Ping'an learned about the intricacies of kasayas, as well as the differences between reciting monks, lecturing monks, mentor monks, and guardian monks. One time, he left the capital city to get some fresh air, and he followed a group of monks that were carrying out some secret instruction for the imperial court from afar. Each of the monks had a set of prayer beads, and if they were to ever be harassed by evil spirits, the prayer beads would release bursts of golden light to repel them. The monks slowly strode over the ground, leaving a trail of lotus flowers in their wake, as they guided the tens of thousands of resentful souls toward the entrance to the afterlife. In the end, Chan Ping'an sat far away from the monks, imitating them in their prayers as he joined his palms and lowered his head in silence. After returning to the capital city, Chan Ping'an was still unable to find the observing Tao temple. Right as he was about to steel himself to sneak into the imperial palace, he arrived at a well on a bright and sunny day, and he looked into the well to find that it was completely dark, and its bottom was nowhere in sight. After observing the well for a while, he wasn't able to find anything special about it, so he continued to wander around aimlessly. He then looked back at the well, and he felt like the air was slightly cooler beside the well. Following his battle against Kai Jingshan, Cui Dongshan had earned himself the mock title of Kai Clan Patriarch, earning him a great deal of reverence in Mountain Cliff Academy. On top of that, his handsome and cheerful appearance also made him a very popular figure. Cui Dongshan had permission to go wherever he pleased in the academy, and he was always accompanied by his maidservant Xie Xie. On this day, the two of them went to eavesdrop on a lesson from Teacher Gu, and halfway through the lesson, Cui Dongshan fell asleep with his chin resting on the windowsill outside. Xie stood beside him, not daring to wake him up from his beauty sleep, and all of the students in the room were having a very hard time suppressing their laughter. Teacher Gu was so furious that he wanted nothing more than to beat Cui Dongshan with his wooden ruler. But as soon as he thought of how Kai Jingshan had moved out of the capital city with his entire clan, he immediately suppressed his anger. However, he decided that he was going to tell Mao Xiaodong about this and get him to prohibit Cui Dongshan from ever approaching his classroom again. All of a sudden, Cui Dongshan jolted awake as if he had been snapped out of his slumber by a nightmare. And it took him a long while to gather his bearings before he returned to his living quarters with Xie. After Xie closed the gate of the courtyard, Cui Dongshan took off his boots before striding over the doorstep, then swept a sleeve through the air to release a cloud of mist, out of which emerged a map of Eastern Treasured Vile Continent. Cui Dongshan had one arm across his chest while squeezing his chin with his other hand, and he first stood at the northernmost Great Sui Nation on the map, then slowly moved his gaze southward, past Yellow Court Nation and Great Sui Nation's border before resting on the central region, which contained Lakeview Academy, Colorful Garment Nation, and Watercombing Nation. In the end, he suddenly sat on the ground and began to look around. Xie was seated on the doorstep. The map filled virtually the entire room, so if she were to go in, then she would definitely be scolded, perhaps even beaten. Cui Dongshan continued to sit on the ground as he casually asked, "Do you think there's anyone in Great Sui Nation right now that's denouncing the emperor for being an incompetent ruler, who rolled over and conceded without even putting up a fight? I don't know much about what's happening outside the academy, but all of the teachers of the academy are constantly lamenting the nation's state of affairs. Having said that, I haven't heard any of them verbally denounce the emperor," Xie replied in a truthful manner. Cui Dongshan rose to his feet with a smile as he said, "That's one of the annoying things about scholars. They never denounce the emperor. Instead, they only curse the crooked officials, the seductive vixens, the heavens, the earth, anything but the emperor. Of course, there are always exceptions, and there are definitely some scholars who dare to denounce the emperor, but only very rarely will you find one that can raise concise and coherent criticism that strikes the nail right on the head." Xie was already accustomed to Cui Dongshan's ramblings, and she chimed in a placating manner, "Indeed, young master." She made no attempt at all to disguise her placating attitude, to the point that even someone as clueless as Li Huai would have been able to see through her half-hearted response, let alone someone as shrewd as Cui Dongshan. However, he didn't seem bothered by this. All of a sudden, he put his hands on his hips, then opened his mouth and sucked the entire cloud of mist into his belly along with the map. After that, he raised his hands and curled his fingers into claws, then put on a menacing expression to feign a tiger's roar, while Xie struggled to contain her disdain. Cui Dongshan then patted his own belly with a gleeful expression as he sighed. "To think that there exists a man like myself, who's simultaneously as fierce as a tiger and as shrewd as a fox." Xie had to muster up all of her self-control just to not roll her eyes. She turned her gaze to the wall of the courtyard. Regardless of how much unrest was brewing in Great Sui Nation's imperial court, it was yet another tranquil and uneventful day in the academy. All of a sudden, a silent golden thread shot forth from outside the courtyard as fast as lightning. It was extraordinarily thin, even more so than a strand of Xie's hair, but as soon as this delicate-looking golden thread appeared, the air temperature in the entire courtyard was instantly elevated significantly, replacing the cold chill of autumn with the sweltering heat of summer. Xie was completely dumbstruck, and her mind went blank. Despite the sweltering heat in the courtyard, she felt as if her entire body had been plunged into a glacial pit. She turned around in a stiff and wooden fashion, right in time to see the golden thread pierce through Cui Dongshan's glabella, following which he toppled to the ground. This had to have been an assassination attempt from an Earth immortal. In the distance, an elated voice rang out. "That's what you get for bringing disaster to our nation." Even further away in the distance, Mao Xiaodong's enraged voice reverberated across the heavens. "Who dares to kill in my academy?" Xie was completely dazed as she remained seated on the doorstep, staring at Cui Dongshan's lifeless body. Is he really dead just like that? All of a sudden, she felt a pat on the shoulder, and she was immediately snapped out of her reverie as she swiveled around while swinging an arm through the air, only to then hurriedly withdraw her hand as her mouth gaped open in shock. As it turned out, Cui Dongshan was standing right in front of her. bending down to look her in the eyes. With one hand clasped behind his back, he extended the index finger of his other hand, tapping it against Xiexie's forehead to push her into the room. However, even though Xiexie's body had fallen to the ground in the room, her soul remained in its original spot, having been extracted out of her body by a secret technique from Cui Dongshan. Her soul was unable to withstand the ravages of the yang energy in the air, and it was on the verge of dissipating. Cui Dongshan examined Xiexie's soul for a moment, then discovered something amiss in one of her acupoints. A smile then appeared on his face as he murmured to himself, "You're not getting me with such a crude little trick." After that, he reached out to pluck a speck of dark green light out of Xiexie's soul, then casually squeezed it between his fingers until it burst. Cui Dongshan slapped Xiexie's soul across the face. He scoffed, "What do I even keep you around for? Get back into your body." With her soul restored, Xiexie slowly awakened with a splitting headache. She struggled to a seated position, pressing one hand against the ground for support while holding her other hand over her forehead. She was in so much pain that tears were flowing down her face. Cui Dongshan then strode over the doorstep before picking up a substitution puppet talisman of an extremely high caliber. He gnashed the talisman into powder between his fingers, then turned around with a smile as he yelled, "You're just going to take that, Mao Xiaodong? Someone just took a shit in your house." Mao Xiaodong was in the process of pursuing the assassin, and his sneering voice rang out within the courtyard. "Indeed, you are that pile of shit. In that case, with me walking around every day, doesn't that make our Mountain Cliff Academy a giant toilet?"
Cui Dongshan chuckled.
Xiexie remained silent, and Cui Dongshan couldn't be bothered to talk to her either. He sat down with his legs crossed and fell into deep thought. Why was Lakeview Academy being so passive? The southbound march of the Great Li Empire's army hadn't progressed in accordance with his plan at all. He had originally projected that the army would have to endure at least 4 grueling battles, one against the mortal empires near the central region of the continent, one against Lakeview Academy, one against the White Frost Empire, and one against the immortal powers in the southern region of Eastern Treasured Vile Continent. Could it be that many powers outside of the Great Li Empire's Mahis powers had snuck into Eastern Treasured Vile Continent? Unfortunately, he was no longer the imperial preceptor of the Great Li Empire, so he was no longer privy to the insider information at the very top. As a result, he had no idea who was behind this and what their intentions were. Have you ever thought about permanently settling in the Dragon Spring prefecture of the Great Li Empire?
Cui Dongshan suddenly asked.
No, Xiexie replied with a shake of her head. Right at this moment, Mao Xiaodong made his way into the courtyard and declared, "It was a nascent tier cultivator of unknown origins. He managed to get away." Cui Dongshan was completely unbothered, and he smiled as he said, "That was only an initial probe. You should be more worried about the teachers and students of the academy. There are always some people in this world who think of themselves as saviors, and that the world should be a certain way. If Mountain Cliff Academy comes into opposition against the capital city of Great Sui Nation, it's not impossible for the alliance between the Gao clan and the Song clan to be abolished. Will I have to put the mountain under lockdown?" Mao Xiaodong murmured with tightly furrowed brows. It didn't really make much of a difference whether the assassin had been sent by certain powers of Great Sui Nation, or by Cui Chan's personal enemies. In any case, the possibility that Cui Dongshan had raised was definitely one that had to be taken seriously. "What? Do you feel like you'd be losing face by doing that?" Cui Dongshan asked with a cold sneer. Mao Xiaodong offered no response, making up his mind before departing. Cui Dongshan smiled as he called out after him, "Mao Xiaodong, if you call yourself a pile of shit right now, I can help protect the academy if something happens." "I'm a pile of shit," Mao Xiaodong immediately declared without any hesitation. A look of regret appeared on Cui Dongshan's face as he negotiated. "If I call myself 2 piles of shit, can I take back what I said just now and stay out of this conflict?" "No," Mao Xiaodong replied in a categorical voice, then quickly departed, leaving Cui Dongshan to lament his rash decision. He then dropped down onto his backside before laying back onto the ground and rolling from side to side. After a while, Cui Dongshan seemed to have gotten sick of rolling around like a child, and he laid as still as a board on the ground as he sighed. "When are you coming back, teacher? Your disciple is being bullied." Xiexie was left feeling completely exasperated. Cui Dongshan raised his head as he asked, You think it sounds like I'm joking, right? Xie hesitated momentarily, but ultimately nodded in response. Cui Dongshan rolled onto his side, supporting his head with one hand as he smiled and said, Chun Ping'an's cultivation base may not be very high, but with him here, I wouldn't have to think about anything. If I do something wrong, he'll scold me, and if I do something right, then I'll be spared a scolding. You'll be able to take fewer beatings from me, and as for Yu Lu, he can just stand by and watch as usual. Lin Shui will be more focused on his cultivation, while Li Huai will be able to justify his own cowardice as he'll have Chun Ping'an to protect him. All of the hard work will fall onto his shoulders, while I can kick back and relax. Cui Dongshan's voice trailed off there, and Xie was left wondering why he had left out Li Baoping. After a while, Cui Dongshan sighed. Our little Baoping is probably the only one who'll feel bad for my teacher. After the brief assassination debacle, Mountain Cliff Academy was placed under lockdown under the insistence of Mao Xiaodong. No one from the academy was allowed to leave, whether they be teachers, students, or janitors. The official mountain master, Great Sui Nation's Minister of Rights, was strongly opposed to this, but the emperor supported this decision and even sent a few elders in secret to bolster the academy's defenses. On top of that, he also officially enrolled Gao Xian in the academy. On this day, Gao Xian was fishing at the lake with his good friend Yu Lu. As time passed, Yu Lu was finally willing to come clean to Gao Xian, revealing to him that he was once the prince of the Lu Empire, and that he was also a 7th-tier martial artist. Gao Xian wasn't all that surprised to hear about Yu Lu's past identity, but was amazed by Yu Lu's martial arts cultivation base, and his eyes were glittering with pride for having chosen such a great friend. In return, Gao Xian also told Yu Lu about many of his troubles and concerns. Whenever he was with women, he would do his best to present the best side of himself, even if he didn't necessarily have romantic feelings for them. In contrast, when he was with men, he could reveal all of his flaws and display the most genuine side of himself, and he truly did consider Yu Lu to be a friend. Each of them was holding a green bamboo fishing rod, waiting for a fish to bite, and Gao Xian suddenly asked, Didn't you say that Baoping was going to arrange a martial gathering? Why is it that I've never seen you attend one, even though I've already been in the academy for so long? Yu Lu smiled as he replied, Baoping arranged 3 martial gatherings, but didn't organize any more after that. I don't know about anyone else, but I'm a little disappointed. Li Huai's over there, Gao Xian said with a smile as he pointed at a small path on the bank of the lake. Yu Lu didn't turn to look. Even without looking, he knew that Li Huai was definitely playing with his 2 friends. One of them was a rather crass child from a humble upbringing, while the other came from a wealthy and powerful clan, but had a very timid and introverted personality. It was a very unlikely trio, but somehow they got along extremely well and spent virtually all of their waking hours together. Apparently, the aforementioned crass child had proposed that they become brothers by holding a ceremony of chopping off chicken heads and burning yellow paper. The chickens were actually just sparrows that they had caught from trees, while the yellow paper were pages that they had torn out books in the scripture library in secret. After it was revealed what they had done, they had received a thorough beating from their teacher. The 3 of them were having a sword fight by the lake using tree branches, and it didn't take long before Li Huai spotted Yu Lu fishing by the river, but after some hesitation, he ultimately decided not to greet Yu Lu. If it were Lin Shui, perhaps Li Huai would approach him for a chat, but he wasn't all that close with Yu Lu and Xie. Li Huai, Li Baoping, and Lin Shui had grown up together and also made the journey to Great Sui Nation together, so Li Huai shared a far closer bond with them than he did with Yu Lu and Xie. At the moment, Lin Shui wasn't visiting the scripture library much. Outside of his daily lessons, he spent most of his time cultivating in his own independent courtyard, which had been secured for him from the academy by a very well-respected teacher. The teacher was a cultivator himself, and he wasn't stingy at all when it came to imparting his knowledge upon Lin Shui. Not only did he explain all of the intricacies of the recite atop cloud scripture, he also brought him several immortal scriptures from his own collection for Lin Shui to read. Whenever he had time, he would be sure to visit the courtyard to answer all of Lin Shui's questions. Officially, they weren't teacher and disciple, but that was very much the nature of their relationship. Aside from his studies, Lin Shui dedicated most of his energy and attention to cultivation. In the chill of autumn, Li Baoping had exchanged her usual thin red dress for a slightly thicker one, but her usual red jacket was still not required yet. As usual, she would often climb to the top of a tall tree on the mountain by herself and sit on a branch to stare off into space, or eat some pastries to satisfy her cravings. Occasionally, she would also bring some books up to trees to memorize certain passages, so that she wouldn't be punished by her teachers the next day. Thankfully, whenever she had some spare time, she would transcribe copies of certain scriptures in advance, so that she could submit them whenever she did receive a punishment. At this point, she had already accumulated a neat stack of these pre-copied scriptures in her dormitory room, and for that, she had earned herself the nickname of the transcription girl. On this day, she was swinging her feet back and forth while seated on her branch, counting on her fingers the number of days since she had last seen her junior uncle. It's been so long, why is he still not back? A slightly dejected look appeared in her eyes. Hold on, if it's already been so long, doesn't that mean that it's closer to the next time that we meet? A cheerful look appeared on her face at this thought, and she began to skip up and down on her branch, trying to see as far into the distance as possible. Perhaps her junior uncle was already standing at the foot of the mountain. A loud thump rang out as she fell onto the ground. Thankfully, with all her experience in falling, she knew how to fall while hurting herself as little as possible, so she was able to avoid injury, but bruises were inevitable. She hurriedly looked around, and only after ensuring that no one had seen her embarrassing display did she begin hobbling down the mountain. Many people greeted her along the way, and she returned all of their greetings. After returning to her dormitory room, she had nothing to do, so she began transcribing books again. She took a glance at the pile of transcriptions that she had already accumulated, and a bright smile appeared on her face. The next time her junior uncle came to visit her, she would be able to flunk her lessons for a whole 10 days, and her supply of transcriptions would be sufficient to deal with any punishment handed down upon her. With that in mind, she felt herself to be a genius, and while making transcriptions with one hand in a well-rehearsed manner, she gave herself a thumbs up with her other hand as she murmured, "As expected of the Alliance leader, I'm so smart and badass." On Downtrodden Mountain, the little boy in azure very rarely went out, but after receiving a letter, he first went into the small town to send a letter in reply, then confidently paid a visit to Cloud Drape Mountain to seek out Wei Bo in the Northern Mountain Palace. However, upon his return to the bamboo building, the little girl in pink noticed that he wasn't in very high spirits. She didn't know why he had left the bamboo building, but it was clear that he hadn't managed to achieve his objectives. The little boy in azure didn't want to complain to her, so he sat on a cliff on his own, sighing to himself. However, it didn't take long before he was reinvigorated, and he paid another visit to the small town, even steeling himself to visit the county office and the kiln supervision office. However, upon his return, he was once again looking very down and dejected, but after 2 more days, he went to the newly constructed Dragon Spring Prefectural City to the north to request an audience with Prefectural Overseer Wu Yuan. The little girl in pink was rather perplexed to see the little boy in azure so busy all of a sudden. Even though he always acted quite casual and lackadaisical, she knew that he was extremely proud and arrogant, to the point that he even looked down on Wei Bo in the past. In front of Wei Bo, he would always act in a sycophantic fashion, but behind Wei Bo's back, he would immediately denounce the mountain god. So he certainly had no respect for the likes of County Magistrate Yuan, Kiln Supervision Official Chow, or Prefectural Overseer Wu. One day, the little girl in pink couldn't help but ask what the little boy in azure had been doing, to which he replied that there was no point in telling her as she wouldn't understand anyway. After that, he carried a bamboo chair onto the cliff, where he sat in dejection on his own. Finally, there came a day when the little boy in azure regained his swagger. With a smug look on his face, the little boy in azure declared, "I've successfully carried out what's been asked of me by my water god friend, and I've already sent a letter to the Imperial River God Temple of Yellow Court Nation." "What did the Imperial River God want you to do?" the little girl in pink asked with a surprised expression. "Now that Yellow Court Nation has become a subsidiary nation to the Great Li Empire, my river god friend wanted me to put in a good word for him as he heard that I've been doing quite well in the Great Li Empire. He wanted to ensure that his river god temple wouldn't be demolished, and ideally, he also wanted a peace and safety tablet from the Great Li Empire. Of course, I was able to have these trivial matters arranged for him with ease, The little boy in azure replied with a wide smile. As it turned out, the imperial river god had sent a letter to him with these requests, and the little boy in azure had immediately assured him that these requests could be easily fulfilled. He boasted extensively to the imperial river god, telling him to sit back and wait for good news. The little girl in pink had been flabbergasted to hear this. If these were nothing more than trivial matters, then why was it that he had been so agitated and depressed these past few days? Besides, how could he be so shameless in proclaiming that he was doing well in the Dragon Spring Prefecture? He was forced to work hard in his cultivation, just to avoid being beaten to death by some random pedestrian on the streets. The little girl in pink knew that he had to have been extremely fearful whenever he made a trip down the mountain, and she asked, "Was it Mountain God Wei who helped you take care of everything?" The smile on the face of the little boy in azure changed complexions ever so slightly, but he still maintained a strong front as he replied, "Of course. Wei Bo and I are so close that we're constantly referring to each other as brothers. There's no way Wei Bo would refuse such a minor request from me. The first time I went to visit Wei Bo on Cloud Drape Mountain, he was out doing something, and the deputy deity in the northern mountain palace was so welcoming and hospitable, arranging a massive banquet for me. I told him there was no need for that, but he insisted that I stay. It was all a huge pain in the backside." The little girl in pink didn't say anything. She knew that the little boy in azure was extremely proud, so she didn't want to expose him. Initially, the little boy in azure was speaking in a very animated fashion, but he became more and more deflated as he spoke, and in the end, he fell silent altogether. During their second meeting, Wei Bo had indeed agreed to ask for a pair of talismans from the Great Li Empire for his imperial river god friend, but it had come at a price, namely one of the finest snake gall pebbles that Chan Ping'an had given to him. It was a very steep price to pay, but the little boy in azure didn't regret it. All of a sudden, a wide smile reappeared on his face as he pointed to the south and said, "When we visit the imperial river in the future, I'll take you to my river god friend's manor. He'll treat us to a massive feast, and I'll show you just how popular and loved I am there. You'll be revered by everyone just because you're with me." The little girl in pink had no response to this. However, she then caught a glimpse of the excited look on the face of the little boy in azure, and she couldn't bear to rain on her parade, so she said in a quiet voice, "All right, but I don't want to eat a lot of meat. Just prepare a feast of in-season vegetables for me." "That's not a problem at all," the little boy in azure vowed with a slap on his own chest. After that, the conversation devolved into silence. All of a sudden he said, "If our master were here, I would have probably been able to get the same things done in fewer trips." The little girl in pink nodded in response. Over on the mountain in the west, business for Dong Shuijing's wonton stall was improving by the day. All of the people who came to visit the mountain god temple liked to have a bowl of his wonton soup to fill their bellies and replenish their weary bodies. Soon the stall became too small to support his business, so Dong Shuijing constructed a shop. That way, customers would be able to enjoy their wontons under some shelter on stormy days and wait until the storm passed. On top of that, he made it clear that people were welcome to wait out storms in his shop, even if they didn't buy anything. Not only would he not kick them out, he would even send one of his 2 newly hired employees to fetch them a bowl of hot tea. Despite the increased costs of running a shop, Dong Shuijing never compromised on quality, nor did he raise his prices. Before long, his shop had gained such a stellar reputation that it was visited by several of the highest-ranking officials of the Dragon Spring Prefecture, and even prefectural overseer Wu Yuan had been full of praise for his wontons. That day, at about dusk, the shop was about to close, and the waiters were taking care of the last few tables of customers. Dong Shuijing was exhausted after a day of work, and he sat down at the entrance of his shop, sipping on a bowl of tea. All of a sudden, he rose to his feet and hurriedly finished the rest of his tea, then quickly made his way toward a group of people that were coming down the mountain. One of them was a familiar figure who was most likely only just leaving with her clan's seniors after offering up some incense at the mountain god temple, and judging by the time, they were most likely going to be staying the night in the Dragon Spring prefectural city. Dong Shuijing smiled as he called out to the group, greeting the adults as uncles and aunts before turning to the girl that was slightly taller than him as he asked, "When did you get back, Shi Chuanjia?" Shi Chuanjia no longer had her hair arranged into braids. After returning to the small town following their brief, Yet terrifying journey with Li Baoping and the others, the children had gone their separate ways, having each made different life decisions. Li Baoping, Li Huai, and Lin Shui had traveled to Great Sui Nation with Chan Ping'an, while Dong Shuijing remained in the small town. He attended school for a while, but quickly left and sold one of his clan's 2 ancestral residences in the town. With that money, he was able to buy half a street's worth of mansions in the prefectural city, and he still had enough left over to start his own business. As for Shi Chuanjia, her clan had sold their shop on Dragon Riding Alley, then moved to the capital city of Great Sui Nation, and it was unclear why they had returned to their hometown on this occasion. Shi Chuanjia's parents had only ever heard of Dong Shuijing, but never met him. They could see that their daughter was still very attached to him, so they decided to have a few bowls of wontons at his shop. Dong Shuijing cooked up the wontons himself before personally carrying them to the table, then made some small talk before returning to the counter. Shi Chuanjia hurriedly finished her bowl of wontons, then rushed over to Dong Shuijing's side and quietly asked him if there had been any news about Li Baoping. Dong Shuijing was only able to relate to her some of the things that Chan Ping'an had told him, and Shi Chuanjia listened with keen interest, latching onto every word. Dong Shuijing could see that her family was about to finish their meal, and he asked in a seemingly casual manner, "Are you going to be staying here for a while?" Shi Chuanjia nodded in response. "We heard that the new school here was founded by the Dragontail Creek Chang clan, so my grandfather told my parents and I to come back. We've sold the shop, but we still have our ancestral residence, so we'll have a place to stay." Dong Shuijing nodded in response. In the end, he still charged Shi Chuanjia and her family for the meal, but he gave them a discount of a few copper coins per bowl of wonton soup. Shi Chuanjia was a very direct and straightforward girl, and she glowered intently at Dong Shuijing for daring to charge them for their meal, feeling as if he had become a money-hungry scoundrel. Dong Shuijing merely smiled in response, completely unfazed. He watched them as he departed, and he knew that there would be many more opportunities for them to meet in the future. He certainly wasn't going to charge his acquaintances extra at his shop, but he couldn't just not charge them either, and the best policy was to ensure that he broke even. Otherwise, the longer he ran this business, the fewer friends he would have. If a friend were to constantly freeload off your kindness, then that indicated that they didn't regard you as a friend. However, if he were to take advantage of his friends and charge them extra, then they would eventually come to realize that he didn't see them as friends. Hence, this was the perfect balance to strike. By the time the final table of customers left, the 2 waiters were so exhausted that they could barely stand. Dong Shuijing made 2 bowls of wonton soup for them each, and he watched them scarf down their meals for a moment, then turned to look out the entrance of the shop, right as a man carrying a long sword on his back made his way over the doorstep. It was the Maha's swordsman by the name of Su Ruo, and he had come here directly from the Dragon Spring Prefecture ferry station after his return from Old Dragon City. He smiled as he asked, "I've already broken the rules by telling you her information. Have you made a decision?" Dong Shuijing nodded in response. Seeing as she had already become an immortal, he couldn't keep whiling away his days. If he could become a so-called saber-lending cultivator, then he would be able to extend his own lifespan. Regardless of whether he could be with her in the end, at the very least, he would be able to take a few more looks at her before he died. A little devil with the surname of Gu had appeared in Bamboo Scroll Lake. His name was Gu Kan, and he was the final disciple of river-severing true Lord Lu Jimao. He had somehow tamed a flood dragon at the pinnacle of the Golden Courtier, and during the internal conflict that took place, the flood dragon had claimed countless lives on Cyan Gorge Island. However, strangely enough, Lu Jimao made no effort to intervene at all, even after his first disciple was killed by the flood dragon. If that had been the extent of his feats, then he wouldn't have been notorious across the entirety of the vast Bamboo Scroll Lake. The main reason for his notoriety stemmed from the story of an innocent-looking child, who would often be seen strolling around aimlessly on Bamboo Scroll Lake. Initially, some chi refiners came under the false impression that he was using some type of water-treading technique that allowed him to casually roam over the surface of the lake without having to move his feet. Generally speaking, the child was left to his own devices, but one day tragedy struck. On this day, a group of around 24 young chi refiners were traveling over the lake in a huge luchuan when they encountered that child, and neither side was willing to go around the other, so a conflict arose. Right as the two were about to crash into each other, the child suddenly began to rise up into the air, and it was revealed that he was standing atop an enormous flood dragon that snapped the Luchuan into two with a single swipe of its claws. The chi refiner that attempted to flee the Luchuan were targeted by a pillar of water that was blasted out of the beast's mouth, completely stripping them of their flesh and leaving only a skeleton behind. As for the ones who fell into the water, they all perished under the flood dragon's claws or were thrown into its mouth and eaten alive. The flood dragon was completely impervious to all weapons and mystical abilities. In fact, it couldn't even be bothered to evade the attacks. The chi refiner who met the worst fate out of everyone was one who came up with the clever idea of targeting Gu Ken instead of the flood dragon. He was a swordsman who had a bit of reputation in Bamboo Scroll Lake, and he attempted to snipe down Gu Ken using his bonded flying sword. Up to that point, the flood dragon had been in quite a playful mood, but it had immediately flown into a thunderous rage, whipping up enormous waves in the surrounding water with its powerful body to trap the swordsman in a cage of water. After that, it used some type of secret technique to suck all of the air out of the cage, subjecting the swordsman to a slow and torturous death to asphyxiation. In the end, his spiritual energy had run out, and his body had exploded with a resounding thump, sending blood splattering all directions in the cage, while Gu Ken chortled with glee as he sat atop the flood dragon's head. Some Dragon Gate tier and Golden Core tier cultivators had stormed onto the scene, only to be horrified by the sight that they were greeted by. During the battle on Cyan Gorge Island, the flood dragon had been very far away, and it hadn't displayed any abilities similar to those of chi refiners, but in the short time since then, it seemed to have unlocked its innate ability. This was an extremely significant hurdle to cross, and it meant the flood dragon now possessed the power of an earth immortal. In this state, it would be able to attain a human form, and back in the ancient past, when flood dragons had been around in large numbers, that would have granted it the right to establish a dragon palace of its own in a large river. Initially, this group of vastly renowned Bamboo Scroll Lake cultivators thought that they would be able to sneak in and save a few of their disciples, but the first one to attempt such a feat, a Dragon Gate tier cultivator, was struck down by a casual swipe of the flood dragon's claws from several hundred feet away, causing his entire body to explode. When it came to battles between cultivators of the middle 5 tiers, even an advantage of a single tier often proved to be decisive, but generally speaking, one wouldn't expect to see a cultivator of that caliber struck down so easily. The remaining cultivators exchanged a few fearful glances with one another, and all of them chose to retreat, abandoning their disciples to protect themselves. After that, some people snuck into Cyan Gorge Island in an attempt to assassinate Gu Ken, but all of them were killed by Lu Jimao. Over the course of half a year, 5 or 6 assassination attempts were staged, with all of them ending in failure. Half a year later, Lu Jimao, Gu Ken, and his flood dragon led the charge to the sect on the island where the assassins had come from. The entire sect was massacred with the exception of some young boys and girls who possessed passable cultivation aptitude, and all of the sect's wealth and treasures were also pillaged. In the wake of that event, Cyan Gorge Island became the unofficial leader of all of the islands in Bamboo Scroll Lake, with no one daring to oppose it. Right now, Gu Ken and his mother were living in the most opulent manner on Cyan Gorge Island. He and his master had gone on several crusades to wipe out enemy sects, and whenever such a battle concluded, Gu Ken would get the senior sister who had tipped him off years ago to help him select exceptionally beautiful young girls to serve as candidates for his future harem. The girls that were selected were even instructed in the way of musical instruments, Go, calligraphy, and painting. On this day, Gu Ken made a rare display of staying home instead of going out to play. He accompanied his mother to the rear hall, then knelt down onto a cushion before kowtowing to a memorial tablet. Over the past few years, his mother had become even more alluring and voluptuous thanks to the lavish lifestyle that she was able to enjoy. After rising to her feet, the woman closed her eyes and joined her palms while murmuring quietly to herself, as if she were speaking to her deceased husband. Gu Ken stood in the silent hall, looking up at the incense smoke rising up from the burner. With his hands already stained by the blood of countless others, he suddenly felt unworthy to stand here. While leaving the rear hall together, Gu Ken suddenly called out to his mother. The woman was holding his little hand, and she looked down at him as she asked in a gentle voice, "What is it?" Gu Ken forced a smile and shook his head in response, telling her that it was nothing. In the capital city of Southern Garden Nation, there was an emaciated little girl with a cold look in her eyes. Her clothes were in tatters, and she carefully made her way over to an area where many wealthy and powerful clans were gathered, and she walked directly to the rear entrance of an opulent manor, seemingly having made the trip many times before. It was a very bright and sunny day, and the little girl was sweating profusely from her walk, but the look in her eyes remained as cold as ever. She squatted down under the shade of a large tree, and she looked up at the sun in the sky, which was so bright that it was bringing tears to her eyes. She silently looked away before wiping the tears from her eyes, and a short while later, the rear entrance of the manor was opened by someone in a sneaky fashion. A girl around the same age then snuck out of the narrow gap between the doors. This girl was dressed in fine clothing, and she looked much more delicate and pampered than the girl squatting under the tree. She was holding onto a small wooden box with some difficulty, and she was sweating profusely as she jogged over to the emaciated little girl's side with a bright smile and said, "I have a present for you." Under the intense heat of summer, there was some water seeping out of the wooden box. The emaciated girl accepted the wooden box with furrowed brows before removing its lid. A joyful smile appeared on the other girl's face as she said, "Do you still remember this snowman that we made last winter? I told the servants in the manor to put it in the icehouse to preserve it so that I could give it to you today. Do you like it?" The emaciated girl stared intently at the small snowman, and her head was lowered, making it impossible to see her expression. Meanwhile, the other girl was still asking if she liked her gift in an innocent and naive fashion. The emaciated girl raised her head before asking, "Where's the food?" An apologetic look appeared on the other girl's face as she said, "I'm sorry, I forgot. I have to go to the temple to offer incense with my parents soon, so I won't be able to get you anything to eat today. I'm really sorry." The emaciated girl looked back down at the little snowman in the wooden box, and a loud crack rang out as she accidentally dropped the wooden box onto the ground. The other girl was immediately brought to the verge of tears as she hurriedly crouched down, and the emaciated girl crouched down with her, except she had done so to pick up a nearby rock. She glanced at the snowman in the wooden box, which had snapped into two, then raised her hand up high before swinging the rock viciously down toward the other girl's head. A gentle breeze blew past, and by the time the pretty little girl raised her head with a forced smile on her face to assure her friend that she wasn't mad, she was surprised to discover that a stranger had appeared before her. He was wearing a pristine white robe and carrying a sword on his back, and there was a little red gourd strapped to her waist. The girl blinked away the tears that had welled up in her eyes, then turned to the emaciated girl with an inquisitive gaze. That was when she noticed that the white-robed boy was holding her friend's hand. The boy smiled as he pointed at the back door behind her and said, "You should go home. There's someone waiting for you there." Sure enough, the steward, Grandpa Zhao, had already come looking for her, and the little girl was clinging to the wooden box with a hesitant expression, unsure of whether to give it to her friend or take it back to the icehouse in the manor. Thankfully, the white-robed boy made the decision for her as he said, "Take it back with you. It'll melt soon in this heat, and that would be quite a pity. You can wait for this winter to make this little snowman a big snowman." The little girl nodded eagerly in response, holding the wooden box in her arms as she bade farewell to her friend, whom she had known for close to 2 years at this point. The emaciated girl remained silent, and only after the door had swung shut did Qian Ping'an let go of her hand. He was completely astonished by her cruelty. It was clear that these two were friends, yet she had just tried to kill the other girl, all because she had failed to bring her food one time. "Who are you?" Qian Ping'an asked. "Why do you care?" The little girl countered. Qian Ping'an looked into the emaciated girl's cold eyes, and even though she was still a child who was clearly far younger than Zhu Lu, he still couldn't help but feel a visceral sense of contempt toward her. Qian Ping'an didn't look at her any longer as he turned his gaze to the rear entrance of the manor. There, the benevolent and frail-looking old steward had just made his way over the doorstep with the little girl's hand clasped in his, and also turned to look at Qian Ping'an. Their eyes met, and Qian Ping'an gave him a slight nod, one that was returned by the steward after a brief hesitation. Everything was communicated wordlessly. If Qian Ping'an hadn't appeared, the emaciated girl would already be dead by now. The old man was clearly more than willing to extend a gesture of goodwill toward what appeared to be a young swordsman, and he chose to leave the emaciated girl with him instead of administering the punishment that he had intended. Qian Ping'an turned his gaze back to the emaciated girl as he warned, "Don't come back here again. Otherwise, you're going to be killed." The emaciated girl offered no response, and Qian Ping'an turned to depart. Shortly thereafter, he disappeared out of sight, and the emaciated girl spat disdainfully in his direction, then launched a globule of saliva at the manor in front of her as well. The girl was already starving, and after making those two resentful gestures, she was immediately struck by a rush of dizziness. She returned the same way that she had come, doing her best to stick as close to the wall as possible. As for the white-robed boy, she wasn't fearful of him. Ever since she could remember, she had always been very sensitive to animosity, and she intuitively knew which people she could take advantage of and which people she couldn't afford to mess with. In reality, Qian Ping'an hadn't departed. Instead, he was hiding nearby, observing the little girl in secret. Due to her frail condition, she was forced to take regular breaks as she walked along feebly, and after looking around in a cautious manner for a moment, she flipped over a wall in a well-rehearsed fashion and stole the pickled vegetables from a household. After scarfing down the pickled vegetables, she rushed out of the alley, and she was feeling a little thirsty, so she flipped over the wall again before sneakily scooping out some water out of a vat to drink. Before placing the lid back on the vat, she quickly grabbed a handful of soil from the ground before tossing it inside, and only then did she sneakily depart again. Qian Ping'an could see that she was walking with a bit of a limp, and she was also regularly massaging her own ribs, presumably all results from the physical punishment that she had received for her past misbehavior. Right as Qian Ping'an was about to leave, the little girl arrived in an area filled with livestock, and the ground was caked in feces. There was a group of boys standing there while leaning against a wall, and they seemed to be waiting for her. All of the boys appeared to range somewhere between 13 to 20 years of age, and it was clear that they were up to no good. One of them caught sight of the little girl as she rushed toward them, and he immediately kicked out at her without any warning. If the kick had landed with full force, then it would have been enough to send her flying, but thankfully, the girl seemed to have already anticipated this. However, she didn't take any evasive action. Instead, she intentionally slowed down a little right before the kick landed in order to soften the impact, then made a very convincing act of falling back onto the ground. She then struggled for a while before clambering back to her feet with a wretched expression, and her eyes were filled with sycophantic pleading as she cast her gaze toward the group of boys. A brawny young man who appeared to be the leader of the group instructed the little girl to lead the way without wasting any time, and some time later, they arrived at a dilapidated house that was long abandoned. The little girl pointed at the house, and the leader of the group of young boys put on a menacing smile as he said, "If you've got the wrong place, then I'm going to break both of your legs." The little girl shook her head vigorously, then cupped her own hands in a pleading gesture in front of her own chest. The brawny young man gestured for everyone to surround the house, then turned to the little girl and tossed 7 or 8 copper coins into her cupped hands as he said in a meaningful voice, "Silly me, I forgot to bring the other half. How about you come back home with me to fetch the rest after we're done here?" The little girl shook her head vigorously, then transferred all of the copper coins onto one hand before picking up 3 of them with her free hand and giving them back to the brawny young man. The brawny young man was very pleased by this, and he initially planned to keep playing around with the little girl some more, but he decided against it, seeing how clever and obedient she was. The little girl scurried backward while bowing to the young man several times, and only after that did she turn around to run away. Shortly thereafter, a blood-curdling howl rang out from the house behind her, but she paid no heed to that as she rushed along while looking at the copper coins in her hand, and a wide smile appeared on her weathered and emaciated face. In the wake of the fall of Jewel's small world, the Dragon Spring Prefecture had become a blessed land of sorts, and it was filled with abundant spiritual energy, making it a very alluring place to many. Over the course of the past 2 years, the tens of thousands of demons and spirits in the area had gradually pledged their allegiance to all of the major mountains, establishing a new equilibrium. Among them were 3 golden core tier great demons, all of which had once been extremely feared and revered figures in the area. As for whether there were any nascent tier great demons intentionally concealing themselves as they didn't want to show their hands too early, that was currently unknown. Close to 1,000 demons had perished due to various causes over the past 2 years. Some simply died of natural causes, while others had been executed by the Great Li Empire's imperial court for certain transgressions. However, there weren't many demons of the middle 5 tiers among them. Instead, they mostly consisted of weaker demons whose actions were governed solely by their instincts. Very few demons had been able to secure peace and safety tablets from the Great Li Empire's imperial court. For this purpose, many of them had pledged their subordination to major mountains, serving as guest elders or mountain guardians. Alternatively, some had paid out of their own pockets to establish good relations with the local authorities, or implored certain important figures to put in a good word for them with the Great Li Empire. This unexpected source of income was naturally very much welcome for the Great Li Empire's Ministry of Revenue, and as a result, the animosity between the Ministry of War and the Ministry of Revenue had begun to lessen a little. The Chao and Yuan clans each had a pillar general, and one had great influence over the Ministry of War, while the other presided over the Ministry of Revenue, and it was common knowledge in the imperial court that the two clans had constantly been at each other's throats over the past century. As the sage of this small world, Ruan Qiong had founded the Dragon Spring Sword sect, which had an enormous territory, encompassing many mountains, including Divine Elegance Mountain. However, the sect had very few disciples. A disciple who had been turned away by Wind Snow Temple was responsible for looking after the old sword shop outside the small town. Her name was Su Xiaoqiao, and she very rarely entered the sect. There was also a young man by the name of Donggu, who was a man of very few words and wore black all year round, as well as a boy by the name of Xieling who came from Jewel's small world and had a pair of remarkably long eyebrows. Even if one were to count Ruan Xiao, the Dragon Spring Sword sect still had a pitifully tiny number of members. However, Ruan Qiong wasn't bothered by this at all, and he didn't bother himself with any worldly affairs aside from traveling to the dragon-slaying platform cliff on Dragon's Pine Mountain to deal with the people from Wind Snow Temple and True Martial Mountain. Aside from that, even Prefectural Overseer Wu Yuan and Northern Mountain God Wei Bo were generally given the cold shoulder whenever they tried to visit him, and he also didn't bother to instruct the sect's disciples at all, merely delegating that task to Ruan Xiao instead. On this day, the sun was rising up over Divine Elegance Mountain, illuminating the sea of clouds a bright red color. At this point, Ruan Xiao had already grown into a fine young woman. Compared with when she first arrived in Jewel's small world, her body had become taller, slender, and more proportionate, and she was no longer the little girl that she once was. Standing beside her were Ruan Qiong's first 3 disciples, Su Xiaoqiao, Donggu, and Xieling. It was quite rare for all of them to be in the same place at once. Among the 3 disciples, Su Xiaoqiao liked to refer to Ruan Xiao as senior sister, Donggu liked to call her Miss Xiao, but always spoke to her with a sense of genuine respect, while Xieling generally referred to her as big sister Xiao. At this moment, there was a dog laying at Ruan Xiao's feet. It had previously been a sickly old dog waiting for its own life to come to an end as it lay on a street in the small town, but it had since been completely revitalized. This was thanks to the pills that Ruan Xiao would often feed it, all of which were of an exceptional caliber. One time a qi refiner had been passing through, and he had been appalled to see this. He felt as if he were faring even worse than a dog, and he was struck by the urge to rush over and fight over the pills with the dog. Only several of the tallest mountains in the area were able to peek through the resplendent sea of clouds, and they stood like individual islands in the sky. Ruan Xiao pointed at one of the mountains as she said, "My father says that all you have to do is reach the Golden Core tier, and he'll give you a mountain and hold a mountain opening ceremony for the world to see." She then turned to Donggu as she continued, "You're a spirit, so it'll be more difficult for you to progress in your cultivation than for the 3 of us, but your long lifespan gives you an advantage. On top of that, you already possess a very solid foundation at the Dragon Gate tier, so it's about time that you attempted a breakthrough." Donggu wanted to say something but was rather hesitant. Clearly, he wasn't very confident. The Golden Core tier bottleneck was the most difficult one to break through for cultivators of the middle 5 tiers, and it had stumped countless Dragon Gate tier cultivators in the past. Donggu had left his hometown, leaving behind his status as imperial preceptor of his nation and all of his worldly wealth, just so he could come to Jewel's small world in the hope that the vast abundance of spiritual energy here would increase his chances of progressing to the Golden Core tier. As for the caliber of the Golden Core that he attained and the number of artworks that he managed to manifest in his core abode, those were things that he didn't even dare to think about. The allure of the Dragon Gate tier had made countless chi refiners commit to a lifestyle of tireless cultivation year after year, paying no heed to anything worldly matters. I'll assist you during your breakthrough. I'll draw upon the fortune of the mountains of our sect to help you in your breakthrough as much as possible. Ruan Xiao then pointed at Xialing as she continued. Earlier, your junior brother received an exquisite pagoda that's close to crossing into the realm of celestial tools. It was bestowed upon him by a powerful figure, and it can somewhat mitigate the peril of your breakthrough. A sullen look appeared on Xialing's face, and he was struck by the urge to jump off the cliff and end his own life. That's my most closely guarded secret, big sister Xiao. How could you just reveal it to everyone like that? A hint of excitement finally appeared on Donggu's perpetually wooden and expressionless face, and he extended a grateful bow towards Xialing as he said, I'll be sure to repay you for this, Junio brother Xia. Ruan Xiao turned her gaze back to the sullen Xialing as she said, There's no use in having a powerful treasure if you're not going to make good use of it. Don't always think about keeping it to yourself. Ultimately, the only thing that you can rely on cultivation is yourself, and excessive reliance on external items will have a severe negative impact on your mindset. Why is it that you hear so many stories of nascent tier cultivators perishing during their seclusions? It's precisely because they place too much weight on external objects during their cultivation. Xialing was very amused to hear this long-winded lecture from Ruan Xiao, and Su Xiaoqiao and Donggu were also looking at her with strange looks in their eyes. Ruan Xiao sighed in a deflated manner as she conceded, My father made me memorize all of this stuff. It was a real pain in the arse. Xialing became even more amused upon hearing this, and Su Xiaoqiao and Donggu also exchanged a smile. Donggu, find a good place and decide on a date and time for your breakthrough. Xialing and I will definitely be there when the time comes, Ruan Xiao instructed. Donggu nodded excitedly in response. Ruan Xiao rummaged a silken pouch out of her sleeve, but didn't open it as she said to the three disciples, You can go now. Xialing resided on the mountain, while Donggu was cultivating in a thatch hut at the foot of the mountain, and Su Xiaoqiao was staying in the sword shop on the bank of the Dragon Whisker River. Ruan Xiong had established a rule that prohibited cultivators from flying through the area, so Su Xiaoqiao and Donggu were forced to make the journey down the mountain on foot. As disciples of Dragon Spring Sword Sect, this is your home, so you can fly as you please, no one's going to stop you. My father doesn't care about trivial things like whether you fly or walk. All he cares about is whether you'll be able to reach the Golden Core tier and go beyond that to reach the upper 5 tiers in the future, Ruan Xiao said. Just to clarify, my father didn't say this, but I think that's what he would say if he were here, Ruan Xiao added. Su Xiaoqiao and Donggu continued to depart on foot. Ruan Xiao crouched down as she tossed a peach cake into her own mouth, and her eyes immediately crinkled up into blissful little slits. She then forced her eyes open as much as possible so she could look more serious, then turned to the dog as she mumbled incoherently through her mouthful of cake. You have to cherish these days and know your place. Don't always go around barking at people on the streets. Do you think it's fun? I heard that you almost bit someone once. I told you to look after the courtyard, so why did you come to the mountain on your own? Were you hoping that I would protect you? Ruan Xiao raised a hand as she threatened. I'll kill you right now if you don't behave. The dog immediately fell onto its haunches to beg for mercy. Ruan Xiao took a cold glance at it as she murmured to herself, If it wasn't for him, I could have already had several meals of braised dog meat. The dog began to tremble in fear. Ruan Xiao stood up as she pointed at the path leading down the mountain as she said, Even those chi refiners have to constantly lead disciplined and cautious lives. What is a dog like you doing disobeying my orders? Go and guard the entrance of the mountain. The dog immediately sprinted away like the wind. It had only attained some low-level intelligence, and it had previously felt like Ruan Xiao was a very benevolent and adorable owner. Only in this instant did it come to realize that she had never actually felt any affection for it. Ruan Xiao began munching on her second peach cake, while cupping her hand under her chin to catch the crumbs that fell out of her mouth. She felt as if she could eat these things for the rest of eternity without getting sick of them, and she couldn't help but wonder if those river gods were going to be just as tasty. According to her father, their godly bodies were the best source of sustenance for her cultivation. All of a sudden, she realized that she had begun drooling, and she hurriedly wiped a hand across her lips. That as one of the Lu Empire's earliest subordinate empires, The early history of the Great Li Empire's rise had been one that was filled with humiliation and oppression. After successfully destroying the seemingly invincible Lu Empire, the Great Li Empire had been given an immense boost in power and confidence. In the wake of that long and grueling war, all of the Great Li Empire's citizens, whether they be high-ranking officials or the average person, had been instilled with unmatched confidence. It was this confidence that was the main driving force behind the Great Li Empire's southward expansion. However, it was only when this southward expansion commenced that an unexpected problem arose. The Great Li Empire's soldiers were accustomed to grueling and deadly battles, while the leading officials of the Ministry of War had devised all types of strategies and tactics for the anticipated battles, but they soon discovered that they were all over-prepared. Great Sui Nation was meant to be the Great Li Empire's most formidable enemy in the north, yet the Gao clan had cowered into its shell like a timid turtle. After that, Yellow Court Nation and Great Sui Nation's other subsidiary nations had all handed over their imperial jade seals to the generals of the Great Li Empire without putting up a fight. The resistance that they had encountered thus far had been downright pitiful, and the seasoned warriors of the Great Li Empire had all been left feeling a little dumbstruck and redundant. As they progressed further southward, the battles became slightly more frequent, and sizable armies began to gather in open areas to face the Great Li Empire's army, or remain behind the tall city walls of their fortresses to resist the army's march. There had even been a few small nations that had joined forces to oppose the Great Li Empire's army together. In response to this, the Great Li Empire's army only chose to engage in a few direct battles, but in most cases, they chose to adopt a more strategic approach, weakening their enemies from the inside. It was during this time that the countless Great Li Empire spies scattered across the continent began to make their presence known, turning countless close-knit families and friends against one another. Revolutions began to arise with startling regularity, and important officials of these nations were killed off one after another. The branches of the Great Li Empire's army were all advancing southward with unstoppable might, and it seemed that the unification of the continent was unavoidable. The emperor of the Great Li Empire had released a secret edict that had been sent to all of the army's important generals. Prior to reaching the northern border of Colorful Garment Nation, the generals of the Great Li Empire's army had full autonomy to do what they saw fit without having to secure permission from the Ministry of War. Onward at full speed, everyone! Use the skulls of your enemies as bowls and drink their blood as wine. The emperor very rarely made any displays of emotions, yet he was using such emotive language on his imperial edict. The generals of the Great Li Empire were already brimming with bloodlust, and this call to action only further fueled the flames burning in their hearts. Following behind the army of the Great Li Empire was a second army led by Song Chongjing, which was advancing at a slow and steady pace. Behind that army was Imperial Preceptor Cui Chan, who was overseeing a cohort of Great Li Empire scholarly officials, who were responsible for occupying all of the newly conquered cities. The nations of Eastern Treasured Vile Continent's northern region had all been stomped to bits, and finally, an important city that had gathered the most elite troops of Western River Nation had been conquered. This battle had worn on for 3 months, and it had proven to be extremely arduous. However, with the number 1 border city of the Western River Nation conquered, the reign of the nation's imperial Han clan was as good as over. Despite this victory, this branch of the Great Li Empire's army was not in the mood to celebrate. Not only had they suffered severe casualties during the course of the battle, another branch of the Great Li Empire had snuck into Western River Nation while this branch had been tackling the most formidable foe, and that branch had managed to conquer around a dozen cities virtually overnight. On top of that, it was said that they were about to storm into the capital city of Western River Nation. It was naturally not a good feeling to do all the hard work, only for someone else to reap the spoils, and many soldiers went to complain to their general while still drenched in blood. But the general merely listened to their complaints and offered no response. Under the protection of a unit of several dozen elite guards, a man wearing an ordinary suit of generic armor slowly made his way into the city while observing his war-torn surroundings, and he was completely unaffected by the mass outrage from his subordinates. This general, Song Feng, was a member of the Great Li Empire's imperial clan. At only 30 years of age, his bloodline was actually rather far removed from His Majesty's official main branch, but he had an exceptional reputation. He had been serving in the army for close to 10 years, and during that time, he had rarely ever returned to the capital city. Song Feng wasn't the type of fierce general who would lead the way into battle. After all, he was a member of the imperial clan, and even if he were willing to put himself in harm's way, all of his subordinates would do everything in their power to dissuade him. If he were to die, everyone would be held culpable. Thankfully, Song Feng wasn't the type to insist on leading the way into battle, just so that he could have a reputation as a brave general, even if it meant placing his subordinates in a very difficult situation. Over his military career, he had spent countless days and nights with his fellow comrades. Initially, he had only been a lowly commander, but he had since become a respected border general, and all of his troops would gladly lay down their lives for him. The battle that had just concluded had been an extremely grueling one. In total, Song Feng's branch of the army had been accompanied by over 30 qi refiners, close to half of whom had perished during the recently concluded battle. It was a loss as severe as everything that his troops had suffered up to this point in its southward march combined, and at this moment Song Feng was only accompanied by 2 qi refiners. One of them was an imposing, half-naked man who was 9 feet tall, with a greatly empire piece and safety tablet hanging from his waist. He was holding a pair of enormous maces, and his steed was far larger than even the ones ridden by the heavy cavalry. Aside from the jade table, the man also had 2 bloody heads hanging from his waist. These were the most prized spoils that he had reaped during this battle, and the 2 heads both belonged to vastly renowned qi refiners of Western River Nation. In contrast with the brawny man's eye-catching appearance, the other qi refiner was far more inconspicuous. He appeared to be even younger than Song Feng, and he was quite a handsome man, dressed in a gray cotton robe. There was a perpetual smile on his face, and 2 swords strapped to his waist, one having a white scabbard, while the other's was black. The young man's hands were tucked up his sleeves, and was walking along in a lackadaisical fashion. All of a sudden, a burst of sword light erupted into the sky in the distance somewhere in the city, and the brawny man immediately rode off in that direction while turning to Song Feng with a smile as he said, "The battle has already been won, but there will inevitably still be some enemy survivors. If I get there late, then there won't be any spoils for me to reap. Look after yourself and take care that you don't fall off your horse, General." The brawny man was a powerful qi refiner who had only recently joined this branch of the army, and it was said that he had once been the right-hand man to a very important figure in the imperial court. Due to that important figure's fall from grace, he had no choice but to leave the capital city to earn some accolades on the battlefield. He had seen more than his fair share of powerful figures in the capital city, so he didn't have a lot of respect for Song Feng. The brawny man then turned to the gray-robed young man beside Song Feng as he continued, "And you there, wash your little arse and come find me, and I'll hand over whatever spoils I'm about to reap to you free of charge. What do you say?" Despite the humiliating remark that had been directed at him, the young cultivator's smile remained unchanged, and he merely waved a hand in the brawny man's direction, urging him to hurry instead of wasting any more time here. The brawny man burst into laughter as he raised his backside high up off his saddle, then gave it a hearty slap and waved it from side to side a few times. Only then did he sit back down onto his saddle before galloping away in the direction of the eruption of sword light. The elite cavalry accompanying Song Feng were all furious, but Song Feng and the gray-robed young man were completely unbothered. The cavalry unit slowly made its way toward the general's manor at the center of the city. Inside a crude shop near the city gates were 3 people who had concealed their auras throughout the entire duration of the battle, doing nothing even as the city gates were broken, and the troops of the Greatly Empire stormed into the city to kill everyone who dared to put up any resistance. One of them was the #1 cultivator in this city. Before the city was surrounded by the Greatly Empire's troops, the general stationed in the city had declared that he was going to the capital city to request reinforcements from the emperor. As for the other 2, one of them was a leading figure among the immortal sects of Western River Nation, while the other was a Golden Courtier imperial guest elder from a neighboring nation. The 3 cultivators, 2 at the Golden Courtier and 1 at the Dragon Gate tier, had made no effort to save the city, and even if they had, their efforts would have been futile anyway. 6 of the nations in the area, including Western River Nation, had hatched a secret plot to assassinate Song Feng here. They were going to slay a member of the Imperial Song clan on the battlefield. If they were to succeed, then even if Western River Nation fell, the morale of the other nations would still receive a huge boost. Even if the Six Nations were still inevitably going to be crushed by the Great Li Empire's army, there would be countless brave individuals standing up to oppose them, and that would surely take its toll on the Great Li Empire's forces. They would constantly be harassed without rest, and it would be impossible for them to digest the resources of the Six Nations in a short time and convert them into assets to fund their ongoing southward expansion. As for whether this plan was actually going to work, that was a question that the three cultivators hiding here in the emperors of the Six Nations did their best to avoid contemplating. At this point they had to make a final roll of the dice. Their nations were about to fall and they had to do something. If they could succeed, then they would earn themselves a resounding reputation. They could then abandon their nations and flee to the south, where they would be regarded as heroes and treated as esteemed guests by the large empires there. There was no hope for further progression on the path of cultivation, and their lifespans were about to run out. There was nothing for them to lose, and it was time to go out with a bang. The three cultivators were all lost in their own thoughts. Meanwhile, Feng appeared to be quite relaxed, but in reality, he was holding his horse whip in a white-knuckled grip, and his palms were sweating profusely. The gray-robed man beside him turned to him with a smile and assured, "Don't forget that you have the great Qiao Jun by your side. As long as I'm here, no one can kill you. Having said that, I'm helping you here, so you have to also help me once in return. You don't need to do anything difficult. Just add a qi refiner to the list of casualties that you're going to submit to the imperial court. What do you say? It'll be a piece of cake. Just say that I perished by the hands of the enemy cultivators who are in hiding right now, and that I was a loyal servant who sacrificed myself valiantly to save his master." Feng nodded in response. Qiao Jun extended his hands out of his sleeves, then grabbed onto the hilts of his swords before slowly drawing them out of their scabbards. A loud thump rang out as the spine of his steed was snapped, and it instantly fell dead on the spot. As for Qiao Jun, he had already sprung up into the air and vanished out of sight, leaving only 2 long streaks of light lingering in the air behind him. Around 15 minutes later, the final surviving enemy Golden Core tier cultivator had just had arms and legs severed, and he had no choice but to detonate his own golden core in a fit of grief and indignation. As for Qiao Jun, there wasn't even a single drop of blood on his cotton robe, and as the golden core tier cultivator put an end to his own life, Qiao Jun flew away gracefully atop his sword, and all of the buildings within a radius of 1,000 feet beneath him were instantly razed to the ground, sending a huge cloud of dust rising up into the sky. Feng looked up into the air with a relieved expression, and only then did he pick up the pace. After a brief hesitation, he decided to go to the spot where the eruption of sword light had just emerged. Upon his arrival, he caught sight of the mace-wielding brawny man among the wreckage. His lifeless body was laying in a puddle of his own blood, and he had a spear impaled through his rear end. Qiao Jun was standing on top of the spear, yawning lazily to himself, and he smiled and waved at Feng upon spotting his arrival. From that day forth, Qiao Jun voluntarily relegated himself to a normal scout team instead of remaining by Feng's side. There was a prodigious Dragon Gate tier cultivator constantly trailing the Great Li Empire's forces from afar, collecting a steady stream of minor accolades. On another battlefield in a neighboring nation, he was constantly harvesting the lives of the Great Li Empire's soldiers through underhanded means, but was very secretive about his work, managing to avoid exposure this entire time. In the short span of just half a year, he had killed 160 of the Great Li Empire's elite scouts. All scouts were considered to be the cream of the crop among the Great Li Empire's troops. Due to the fact that he was constantly traveling from one battlefield to another, the young militarian cultivator didn't attract much attention from the Great Li Empire's cultivators. However, as the deaths racked up, the Great Li Empire's forces gradually became aware of his existence, and more cultivators were sent to accompany the troops, concealing themselves among the normal soldiers in the hope that they would be able to catch the culprit in the act. After 2 sea observation tier cultivators were killed, the higher-ups of the Great Li Empire's army finally realized that they were dealing with a serious threat, but before they could act, the militarian cultivator ran away, going around in a massive circle before arriving on the battlefield where Feng's forces were. For Qiao Jun, running into him was a coincidence, but for him, running into Qiao Jun was an inevitability. One who frequently played with fire was inevitably going to get burned. Qiao Jun watched as he killed the 7 scouts with him, then put an end to his life. For cultivators who were adept in battle, it seemed that earning accolades and rising up the ranks would be easy and virtually risk-free, but that was not the case. There was always a taller mountain. Chao Jun imitated the mace-wielding brawny man, decapitating the prodigious Dragon Gate tier cultivator, but instead of stringing it to his own waist, he hung the head from the side of his saddle. After that, he made his way down south on his own, and he imitated the Dragon Gate tier cultivator in assassinating the generals of Western River Nation. He didn't think that he would have better luck than the owner of the head currently hanging from his saddle, but the difference between the two of them was that he had a Dao Guardian, so he didn't have to worry about putting himself in harm's way. All he had to do was kill as he pleased, and if he got into trouble, someone would be there to bail him out. He lowered his head with a smile as he patted the head, which had already been completely drained of blood, and its hair resembled a spruce of withered thatch. "It's a pity that you don't have one," Chao Jun mused. Right at this moment, a slightly displeased voice rang out. "Why didn't you save those scouts? You fought alongside them, so they're your comrades." Chao Jun smiled as he replied, "If I wasn't with them, then they would have died for nothing. At the very least, I was able to exact revenge for them. Should they not be thanking me?" Cultivators were often heartless individuals as they had simply been removed from the mortal world for far too long. Over time, they gradually became detached and insensitive, and they felt no obligation to prevent the shedding of innocent blood. Somewhere in the capital city of Southern Garden Nation, an emaciated little girl was standing in front of a steamed bun shop, salivating incessantly as she stared at the stacks of piping hot bamboo steamers in front of her. The shopkeeper found her to be an eyesore, and he angrily told her to go away, but the little girl stood up straight and spread her hand open to reveal her 5 copper coins. The shopkeeper didn't even bother to take a glance at the money, and he insisted that she go away, threatening to beat her with a bench if she didn't comply. The little girl hurriedly scurried away, then turned to look back at the shop with a dark expression from afar. She then made her way to a pancake stall, where she purchased 2 large pancakes, leaving her with a single copper coin. Just a single pancake would have been enough to sustain her for the day, and initially she really did only eat one, but as she walked along, she became more and more conflicted. In the end, she squatted down at the foot of a wall, then ate the pancake that was supposed to have been her food for the next day. After that, she was immediately overcome by remorse and pinched her own arm viciously as a form of self-administered punishment. However, after rising to her feet, she felt full for the first time in a long time, and that put her in a good mood. She began to rush along the street while occasionally raising her head to look up at the paper kites in the sky with an envious expression. On this night, she didn't return to her little den. The summer night was nice and cool, and she could sleep anywhere without fear of freezing to death. The only downside was that there were many mosquitoes, which was a little vexing. There was a pair of crudely crafted stone lions placed on either side of the gates of a wealthy household, and they were very strange in appearance. Instead of resting on their haunches, these 2 stone lions were standing on all 4 legs, looking up into the distance. The stone lions were at just the right height for the little girl to climb onto the back of one of them, and there she sat for a while, looking up at the night sky before fishing out her only remaining copper coin. She peered at the night sky through the small square hole at the center of the coin, and a wide smile appeared on her face. She then hid the copper coin before laying down to sleep, and before long she was snoring gently. Chen Ping'an was sitting with his legs crossed on the neighboring stone lion, and he turned to look at the sleeping little girl with his brows tightly furrowed, seemingly grappling with some rather conflicted emotions. In the end, he set those emotions aside and closed his eyes to practice his standing meditation, while the little girl slept soundly on the stone lion's back. The next morning, the gates of the manor creaked open, and the emaciated little girl instantly woke up before jumping down from the stone lion's back, then snuck away while sticking close to the wall. Chen Ping'an had naturally woken up before she did, and after watching the little girl leave, he returned to his residence instead of following her any longer. Chen Ping'an had rented a side room in a courtyard in the southern part of the capital city. There was a champion scholar alley nearby that was very renowned, but in reality it couldn't even compare with Apricot Blossom Alley back home. There were many poor scholars who had traveled to the capital city for the imperial examination staying there. Many of them had failed the examination, but couldn't afford to make the return journey, and by remaining in the capital city, they could stay longer with the new friends that they had made, so they decided to settle permanently here. Qian Ping'an only had the key to his room, but no key for the yard gate, so he made sure to return at a time where the yard gate had already been opened for the morning. After returning to the courtyard, he made his way into his own room, then closed the door. He took a glance at the stack of books on his table and the blankets on his bed to find that they had all been moved. The signs were very subtle, but they were quite apparent in his eyes, and he could only heave a resigned sigh. Thankfully, nothing had gone missing. Previously, Qian Ping'an didn't live here. Instead, he had been staying in a large room in an inn so that he could practice his walking fist and sword techniques as he pleased. However, as his fruitless search for the observing Dao temple wore on, he became more and more agitated, and in an extremely rare turn of events, he stopped his practice altogether. In order to save money, he moved into this room, where he would only occasionally practice his standing meditation. He laid down on his bed, then looked up at the ceiling with a dazed expression. He had benefited immensely from this journey, first from his experience on the Sword Chi Great Wall, then from the 2 battles at the Soaring Eagle Fort. In particular, in the wake of that devilish cultivator's core abode self-detonation, a vast amount of spiritual energy had been released, and Qian Ping'an had been a direct beneficiary of that. At this point he could feel that his 4th-tier bottleneck was beginning to loosen, but there was also something missing. He had a vague sense that he could make this breakthrough whenever he wanted, but would rather establish a more solid foundation first. If he couldn't find that missing piece, then perhaps he would just have to follow Lu Tai's advice and pay a visit to a martial sage temple, or seek out the heroic spirits and Yin gods that were still lingering at ancient battlefields. He had to find something to do. Otherwise, he felt as if he were about to grow mold. Qian Ping'an decided that he was going to stay in the capital city of Southern Garden Nation until the end of summer. If he still couldn't find the observing Dao temple by then, he would return to Eastern Treasured Vile Continent and focus all of his efforts on reaching the 7th tier. With the help of Cui Chan's grandfather, Qian Ping'an had a great deal of confidence, and perhaps his 10-year agreement with Ning Yao could be curtailed by a few years. However, deep down, Qian Ping'an was still feeling a little fearful of Cui Chan's unfathomable grandfather, who had declared that he was going to make Qian Ping'an the strongest martial artist under the heavens of each tier that he progressed through. He had already had to endure such immense pain to get to the 3rd tier, and he was genuinely afraid that he would be beaten to death by the old man. Qian Ping'an interlaced his fingers behind his own head and closed his eyes. He wondered if the battle between Aoyang and the so-called true invincible Taoist second disciple in the heavens beyond heavens had been decided. He wondered about what vast mountains and enormous rivers Lu Xianyang had seen on his long journey to the Yingyinchan clan. He wondered if Li Baoping was happy at Mountain Cliff Academy. He wondered if Guqian was being bullied at Bamboo Scroll Lake, and whether he now had a new book that contained the names of his enemies. He wondered if Ruanxiu still enjoyed the peach cakes of the Dragon Riding Alley shop. He wondered if Zhang Shanfeng and Su Yuanxia had made any new friends with whom they could subdue demons and eliminate fiends together. He wondered if Fan Air had met a girl that he liked in Old Dragon City. As these thoughts flashed through his mind, he gradually fell asleep. With 1st and 15th in his sword nurturing gourd, Qian Ping'an didn't have to worry about being vulnerable during sleep. The courtyard was owned by a family of 5, consisting of 3 generations under the same roof. The old man liked to go out to play Go, but he was a very weak player and his etiquette was even worse. The old woman always wore a dark expression and had a very sharp tongue, reminding Qian Ping'an of Granny Ma from Apricot Blossom Alley. As for the young couple, the woman was responsible for housework, and she was constantly being berated by her mother-in-law. According to commonly used slang in the capital city, her husband was someone who carried a shop on his back. Essentially, what that meant was that he walked around with a large bag of junk on his back to sell, and he was constantly loudly advertising his own wares as he made his way through the streets and alleys. On lucky days, he would be able to pick up some valuable old items, then sell them to the antique shops in the city to earn some decent income. The couple were both quite unremarkable in appearance, but they had a very beautiful son who was about 7 or 8 years old. Unlike the other kids in the impoverished alley that he grew up in, he looked much more like a young master from an affluent clan. At school he was very popular with his teachers, and often liked to watch his grandfather play Go, often watching for hours at a time in complete silence. It seemed that he had the makings of a little scholar. Everyone in the alley was very fond of this child, and they often made jokes at his expense, asking him which one he preferred out of the girl living next door and young Mistress Lu from his school. In response, the child would always give a shy smile, then continue to watch his grandfather play Go in silence. After Qian Pingyan fell asleep, a small figure emerged from the ground, then climbed its way onto the table, sitting down beside the stack of books as it began to doze off. The little lotus figure was clearly very proficient in earth movement techniques, and it was able to move extremely fast and in complete silence. Prior to arriving at the capital city of Southern Garden Nation, Qian Pingyan occasionally played some games with it, speeding along on horseback or running full tilt for several dozen kilometers at a time. However, whenever he stopped, the little guy would always be right there, sticking its head out of the earth to smile at him. Regardless of whether Qian Pingyan was practicing his walking or standing meditation, it never disturbed him, merely watching from afar. Only when Qian Pingyan beckoned to it would it skip over to his side, then climb up his robe to sit on his shoulder, and the two of them would appreciate the scenery together. As for that snowflake coin, it was with Qian Pingyan for the moment. Qian Pingyan only had a brief nap before he was woken up by the commotion in the courtyard. The old woman was ranting as usual, while her daughter-in-law responded in a timid voice. The old man was clearing his throat, and the boy was reciting a passage from a book. Only the young man was silent, presumably still sleeping. Qian Pingyan sat down at the table and gently picked up a book, and the little lotus figure also woke up before turning to Qian Pingyan with a bleary-eyed expression. "Go back to sleep," Qian Pingyan said with a smile. The little figure immediately sprang to its feet, then rushed over to Qian Pingyan's side to help him flip over the page of his book, and Qian Pingyan was already accustomed to this. He had newly purchased all of these books after parting ways with Lu Tai at the Soaring Eagle Fort. Lu Tai had told him that it was important to focus on quality over quantity when it came to reading. The more books one read, the more their attention would be divided, and that could easily lead to biting off more than one could chew. Hence, it was much better to read the classics and truly savor them, exploring all of their intricacies, harnessing the principles that they espoused, and peering into the energy, essence, and spirit concealed within the sentences and pages. Only then could one proclaim to have read a book. Otherwise, it could only be referred to as skimming through a book, and even if one were to skim through thousands of books, they wouldn't be able to learn much at all. At the time, Qian Pingyan had felt very much enlightened. If it weren't for these cautionary words from Lu Tai, perhaps he really would have been inclined to buy every single good book that he came across, and he would be sure to read all of them meticulously. However, there was no end to the good books in the world, yet one's lifespan was limited. He had to practice his fist and sword techniques on top of searching for the observing Tao temple, so he didn't have much spare time, and that time was naturally best dedicated to reading the best books. Lu Tai had given him a list of books, and it was a list that Qian Pingyan greatly cherished, but he didn't buy his books according to the list. Instead, he went to purchase the literary classics of the second sage of Confucianism. Unfortunately, it was now impossible to find the scholarly sage's books on the market. He wanted to compare the books of the scholarly sage with those of the second sage. In terms of bias, Qian Pingyan was naturally leaning toward Mr. Qi's teacher. However, there was no problem in admiring and respecting someone, but if admiration turned into blind trust and absolute obedience, then that would lead to major problems. Was the scholarly sage an accomplished scholar? Of course he was. According to Cui Chan, at the height of his influence, the scholarly sage had felt like an insurmountable monolith in the eyes of all scholars. In that case, did Qian Pingyan have the right to think that his principles were incorrect? It seemed almost laughable, like the prospect of an ant trying to topple a tree, but in reality, that was not the case, as the second sage existed, and he had also written his own share of literary classics. Qian Pingyan had once told Ning Yao's parents that in order to truly love someone, then one had to love that person's flaws as well. He had also told the little girl in pink and the little boy in azure to be candid with him if he were to do anything wrong. However, deep down, Qian Pingyan was naturally hoping that after reading the works of both sages, he would still come to the conclusion that the scholarly sage was more correct. If that were the case, then the next time he shared a drink with the old scholar, they would have something to talk about. Qian Pingyan sat in a formal pose, reading very slowly and in a very quiet voice. Whenever he reached the end of a page, the little lotus figure would immediately flip over a new page for him. After that, it would sit back down onto the table between Chan Ping'an and the book, imitating Chan Ping'an's formal and rigid seating posture as it listened to his quiet recitation. The commotion outside was still ongoing, but it was as if Chan Ping'an were in a world of his own, completely detached from the affairs of this world. This was merely a place where he had paid to stay, and he felt no connection to it. Not far away from Champion Scholar Alley were some wine shops and brothels, as well as a temple. Even though they were situated very close to each other, they may as well have been worlds apart. Chan Ping'an often spotted some monks emerging from the temple while carrying bowls in their hands. They were all very thin, but most of them wore very placid and content expressions, and even if they weren't wearing their kasayas, it was still very easy to distinguish them from the average person. Over at the wine shops and brothels, it was always very lively and bustling at night, and the smell of wine and makeup permeated over the entire street. It was often the case that the commotion would only die down in the early hours of the morning. Regardless of whether they were men enjoying the services offered on the street, or the women serving them, all of the people there seemed to thoroughly enjoy themselves over the course of the night, but as soon as daylight arrived, they would all be left looking frail and drained. On a few occasions, Chan Ping'an saw some women escorting their final few customers out of the brothels, then removed their makeup before emerging onto the street outside. There, they would purchase something to eat from the street-side stalls, and some of them would fall asleep while sitting on the street, huddled over their bowls of congee or wontons. Time was more precious than any currency, and they were borrowing time from the heavens. Eventually, the debt would have to be repaid. Some of the stall owners who had grown familiar with these brothel workers would make suggestive remarks at them, and some of the women didn't really care, merely playing along so that they could receive a small discount on their meals. In contrast, some of them took particular offense to such flippant remarks, hurling torrents of abuse at the offending stall owners, who could only mumble apologies in a timid fashion. However, after those women left, the stall owners would then denounce them as whores who sold their flesh for money, and that it didn't make sense for them to be offended by such remarks as they had no shame anyway. The next day, the offended brothel workers still visited the same stalls, while the petulant stall owners would continue to sneak glances at the brothel workers' fair and delicate hands. Those hands were as fair as the skin of the pork that they were selling, and they couldn't even compare with the yellow and weathered hands of their haggard wives back home. The stall owners couldn't help but wonder what these women had been fed that had allowed them to grow up so fair and beautiful, and they also couldn't help but sigh internally at the thought that it would cost them close to half a year's worth of profits from running their stalls just to be able to spend a night with them. Southern Garden Nation had already enjoyed several centuries of peace, and during that time its rulers had all been passable, with none of them particularly exceptional or particularly incompetent. Hence, there was no nightly curfew in the capital city, and people were free to carry around weapons and ride on horseback as they pleased without fear of irking the local authorities. Whenever some acquaintances ran into each other, they would greet one another, and some would even go to a nearby shop for a drink. They would talk about all manners of things, and a liter or two of wine would be gone in no time. In order to search for the observing Tao temple, Chan Ping'an wandered through the capital city every single day, so he had witnessed many of the sights that the city had to offer, including some of the more obscure and strange ones. As long as no one actively provoked him, Chan Ping'an paid no heed to anyone else. Lu Tai had once told him something that he didn't identify with very much at the time, but it had since resonated with him more and more. Upon embarking on the path of cultivation, one would begin to feel as if they could see demons and spirits everywhere. Chan Ping'an closed his book, having spent the past 2 hours reading, and he was about to go out for a walk. Even though he had become more and more agitated over the course of his search for the observing Tao temple, he had made attempts to settle his own mental state. In fact, he had made extensive efforts to do so, including visiting many temples to offer incense to the Buddha and walking alone in peaceful forests. Whenever he visited a temple, he would record the visit on a bamboo slip, and up to this point, he had visited the small temple next to Champion Scholar Alley the most. The temple wasn't very large, only home to about a dozen monks, so Chan Ping'an had become quite familiar with all of the monks there. Whenever he felt agitated, he would go there to have a sit, not necessarily to speak with the monks there. Sometimes, he would sit on his own under the eaves and listen to the sound of the wind chimes for an entire afternoon. In southern Garden Nation, Buddhism was championed over Taoism, so there were countless Buddhist temples in the nation, while Taoist temples were extremely rare, and they were entirely non-existent in the capital city. Over the past few days, a piece of shocking news had been making the rounds in the capital city. A huge piece of controversy had come out of White River Temple, one of the 4 major temples of southern Garden Nation's capital city. White River Temple had always been renowned for how exceptionally devoted their abbots were to the teachings of Buddhism. All of the abbots of the temple that passed away left behind bodies that decay, and could be cremated to make sariras. In this regard, the other 3 major temples all conceded inferiority. Over time, White River Temple became known as a symbol representing the prosperity of Buddhism in southern Garden Nation. However, 2 years ago, a high-ranking monk of White River Temple was nominated to become abbot, and not long ago, he fled the temple to go to the Imperial Court of Judicial Review to report a case. After hearing the case, all of the officials of the court had been completely dumbstruck as it turned out. The abbot had accused White River Temple of poisoning his food and plotting to inject mercury into his body following his death. Not only that, he also revealed the many sins committed by the monks of White River Temple, totaling 6 major crimes, including scamming the wealthy women of the capital city, who paid the temple exorbitant sums of money in exchange for fertility. This was such a shocking case that it alerted even the Emperor of Southern Garden Nation, who ordered for an exhaustive investigation to be launched. The outcome of the investigation was that most of White River Temple's 300 monks were imprisoned, while the rest were banished from the capital city and forbidden from ever becoming monks again. The other 3 major temples remained largely unaffected thanks to their deep-rooted foundations, but many of the smaller temples were adversely affected by this controversy. For example, this Heart Manifestation Temple that was close to Champion Scholar Alley had been receiving far fewer visitors of late. The abbot of Heart Manifestation Temple was a tall and benevolent-looking old monk who spoke with a strong regional dialect. Even though he had been living in the capital city for 30 years, he had never changed his dialect, nor did he like to lecture people about how profound and amazing Buddhism was. Instead, he mostly chatted with others about mundane subjects, and whenever Chun Ping'an spoke to the abbot, he always found the old monk very difficult to understand. Despite this, Chun Ping'an had a very good impression of the abbot, and he could see that the old monk was a cultivator of the lower 5 tiers, but didn't say anything about it. Chun Ping'an left the alley and made his way to Heart Manifestation Temple, where he planned to practice his standing meditation. It was only a 1-kilometer trip, and on the way, Chun Ping'an passed by a martial arts school and an escort agency. Whenever he passed by the martial arts school, he could always hear a bunch of men grunting and yelling within its walls, presumably engaged in martial arts practice. The street outside the escort agency was often packed with escort carriages, and the young men and women on these carriages always looked proud and excited, while the older individuals were a lot more quiet. Initially, whenever they saw Chun Ping'an, they would nod at him as a form of greeting, and Chun Ping'an would cup his fist in a salute in response. After that, Chun Ping'an began actively saluting them, but to his surprise, the old men all lost interest in him, to the point that they didn't even bother to spare him a glance anymore. The old men most likely initially thought that he could be a prodigious young martial artist passing through the area. However, they must have then figured out where he was staying and decided that he posed no threat. In particular, the polite greetings that he always extended toward the old men were most likely construed as a sign of weakness. There were many martial arts schools and escort agencies in the capital city. All of the martial arts sects that had earned a reputation for themselves liked to establish branches here, and these branches were often no less opulent than the manners of high-ranking officials. In contrast, there were very few rumors about chi refiners here, and even the imperial preceptor was only a martial arts master. However, what was most intriguing of all to Chun Ping'an was that there was an unremarkable-looking house that was occupied almost solely by martial artists. For some reason, all of them intentionally kept very low profiles, wearing plain and simple clothes, rarely speaking to anyone outside their own circle, and never showing off their martial arts skills. One time, Chun Ping'an spotted what was very likely a 6th-tier martial artist. He had been accompanied by a young woman wearing a veiled hat that concealed her appearance, but judging from her exceptional figure, she was most likely quite the beauty. Over time, Chen Ping'an began to see the world through new eyes. At the moment, there were very few visitors in Heart Manifestation Temple, consisting mostly of some of the elderly residents living nearby. So all of the monks in the temple were looking quite sullen and concerned. Chen Ping'an had been visiting the temple quite frequently of late, as he could sense that the old abbot's life was about to come to an end soon. On this day, the old monk seemed to have predicted that Chen Ping'an was going to come and waited for him in a side hall. The two of them sat down across from each other on a pair of woven cushions, and the old monk could see that Chen Ping'an was rather hesitant about how to begin the conversation, so he smiled and cut straight to the chase. There have been past abbots of White River Temple that have truly attained godly bodies, so they're not all scammers as everyone proclaims. Don't let this one major blemish ruin the entire long history of White River Temple in your eyes. I wanted my body to be cremated into a few sariras for the temple after I die, but it looks like that's going to be rather difficult in the current social climate. At the very least, we'll have to keep it a secret for some time. Does this count as karma in the teachings of Buddhism? Chen Ping'an asked. Of course, the old monk replied with a nod. White River Temple and Heart Manifestation Temple have never been connected, so it seems like the karmic ties between the two temples are blurry at best, but that's actually not the case. In the context of the all-encompassing reach of Buddhism, everything is interconnected. This was the first time that the old monk had spoken of the teachings of Buddhism to Chen Ping'an. After a brief hesitation, the old monk smiled and continued. Karmic ties do exist between the two temples, but they're too profound and minute too small. There's no way for me to articulate them, so you'll have to seek them out for yourself. The conversations between the two had always been very casual. The old monk would often be interrupted by the younger monks of the temple and have to attend to some matters in the temple, thereby leaving Chen Ping'an to his own devices. Whenever this happened, Chen Ping'an would pull out a bamboo slip or a book that he had brought with him to read, and he never felt offended. On this day, Chen Ping'an didn't bring any books with him. Instead, he only brought with him a thin bamboo slip and a small carving knife. Chen Ping'an was never one to throw away old things, and the carving knife was the one that had been gifted to him by the shop where he had bought the jade tablet. On this day, the old monk was in a very talkative mood, but he spoke no further on the teachings of Buddhism. Instead, he spoke about a wide range of subjects as he did in the past, including the four arts, the state of the nation, the 100 schools of thought. It was all very casual and unstructured. Time slowly passed by. The old monk smiled and asked, "Answer me this. Is an official or a scholar who's committed heinous crimes capable of writing exceptional calligraphy and riveting poetry?" "They are," Chen Ping'an replied with a nod. "Is it possible for renowned heroes and generals of history to have secret misdeeds and flaws unknown to anyone else?" "That's the right answer," the old monk said with a smile. "You mustn't turn to extremes in anything. When preaching to others, the worst thing you can do is think of yourself as absolutely right. One must see good even in the most heinous individuals and bad in even the most virtuous of saints. It's often the case that worldly power struggles can have very severe and long-lasting consequences, but that doesn't mean that the noble and virtuous individuals detached from these power struggles aren't capable of making the same mistakes. The problem is that if you're too soft in power struggles in the imperial court and try to preach this set of logic, you'll most likely meet a very terrible fate, so you can't blame those scholars who've turned to less than savory actions after becoming officials. In that case, can it not be said that everything that I've said up to this point has been nothing more than pointless waffling? What's the point in saying all of this?" Chen Ping'an shook his head with a smile as he replied, "Someone else once preached something similar to me. He taught me to think about everything from different perspectives. Even if the same conclusion is reached and it seems like the exercise was nothing more than a waste of time, it'll ultimately prove to be beneficial in the long run." The old monk nodded with a pleased expression. "Whoever told you that is a very wise man." Chen Ping'an massaged the small bamboo slip in his hand with his fingers as he said in a quiet voice, "One time that same man was drunk and he asked me some questions, but I felt like he was raising those questions to everyone under the heavens. He asked me how many books have I read that I can proclaim that I know what the world is like? How many people have I seen that I dare to say that I know how men and women behave? How much hardship have I witnessed that I dare to judge others as good or evil? The man you speak of must lead a very difficult life," the old monk sighed. All of a sudden, Jian Lai thought of a question that had been plaguing him this entire time, and he asked, do Buddhists really believe in the concept that anyone can attain enlightenment by renouncing their evil past? The old monk smiled as he said, before I answer that, I have another question to ask you. Do you feel like that concept is both terrifying and unique, yet it also feels like an oversimplification that doesn't seem to comply with the true teachings of Buddhism? I don't even know the basics of Buddhism. How am I supposed to know if something complies with the true teachings of Buddhism or not? Jian Lai asked as he scratched his own head. The old monk burst into laughter. The concept of attaining enlightenment by renouncing one's past evil ways is a gross oversimplification. The key is to actually know good and evil. There are many people in the world who unknowingly commit evil deeds, and there are also many people who knowingly do the same. Ultimately, everyone has committed evil in the past, just to different extents, but if one can truly turn their back on their evil ways, then that's certainly a good thing. Enlightenment is another overcomplicated concept. The average layman only sees the moment of enlightenment, but they don't see all of the hard work leading up to that moment. Even if they do, no one wants to put in all that effort. Is it difficult to become a Buddha? Of course it is. It's one thing to know the teachings of Buddhism. What's far more difficult is to abide by, protect, and pass down these teachings. The problem is that the old monk's voice suddenly trailed off here as he heaved a forlorn sigh. He had been a Buddhist his entire life, yet even he couldn't accomplish what he had just described, so what was the point in delving even further into the subject with an outsider? Jian Lai smiled as he encouraged, keep going. Regardless of whether I can accomplish what you're describing, it's certainly always a good thing if I know what to aim for. The old monk waved a hand as he said, let me take a short break and have some tea. My throat feels like it's on fire from all that talking. The old monk called out to a young monk in a nearby pavilion, who appeared to be reading a Buddhist scripture with his head lower, but was actually taking a nap. The young monk immediately snapped wide awake, then hurriedly rushed away to prepare some tea for the abbot and his guest under the old monk's instructions. There was a huge tree nearby with a dense canopy, and a small oriole was perched on one of its branches, pecking at one thing or another. Jian Lai drank his tea much faster than the old monk, and by the time he returned his empty bowl to the young monk, the abbot still wasn't even halfway done with his bowl yet. Jian Lai picked up the bamboo slip that he had brought with him, and there were some faint markings on both sides of the bamboo slip, making it resemble a small ruler. After the old monk finished his bowl of tea, he looked up at the hot summer sun for a moment, then said in an absent-minded manner, in a world devoid of principles, man will be as lifeless and devoid of luster as weeds at the height of a drought, so principles must be protected and passed down. The teachings of Buddhism are principles that monks must abide by, while etiquette lays out the principles that Confucians must follow, and Taoist teachings espouse the principles that guide the actions of Taoists. None of them are bad, so why fixate on differentiating between schools of thought? If a principle is good, then take it and make it your own. Jian Lai looked up from his jade slip with a smile and nodded in response. The old monk cast his gaze out toward the courtyard of the temple as he continued. This world has always been indebted to good people. There are always rights and wrongs in this world. It's just that we don't waste our time and energy assessing the virtues of every little thing. We cannot talk about them, and we can even intentionally say the opposite of what we think, but internally we must know what is right and what is wrong. Unfortunately, there are simply many things in this world that one cannot change. There are more and more clever people, and those who use their wiles and intellect for self-interest often like to scoff at sincerity, denouncing genuine kindness as pretentious and naive. Remember this, Jian Lai, the world will see you in the same way that you see this world. You look at it, and it's also looking at you. Jian Lai felt this to be correct, but didn't ponder it too deeply. The old monk was far more talkative than usual, and Jian Lai was the type of person who liked to mull things over, so he was still pondering the things that the old monk had said earlier. All of a sudden, a bright smile appeared on the old monk's face as he asked, "What do you think of my preaching, Benefactor Chan?" "It was great," Jian Lai replied with a smile as a hint of melancholy welled up in his heart. The old monk continued to smile as he asked, "Previously, I heard you speak about the sequence and magnitude of good and evil. I want to hear about it again." The first time Jian Lai had spoken about this concept, it had been rather clumsy and unrehearsed. However, these were things that came straight from the heart, so the more he spoke about them, the better that he was able to articulate his points, much like a mirror that became brighter and brighter the more it was polished. There was a sequential order to right and wrong, and one shouldn't ignore this order just because they want to espouse their own principles. Rights and wrongs also came in different magnitudes that could be measured using 1, 2, or even more rulers. These rulers were all of the righteous principles of the world, including the laws of legalists, the etiquette of Confucianism, and the prophecies of foretellers. There were also things like baseline laws, morals and ethics, local customs and traditions, and these things couldn't just be encompassed under sweeping generalizations. Instead, all of them had to be studied extensively on an individual basis, and that was an extremely time and energy-consuming process. Only after taking all of that into consideration could the final verdict on good or evil be made. In light of that, the problem of whether human nature was inherently good or evil was no longer a question that couldn't be answered by scholars, as this was a question that should only be answered at the very end, not something for one to decide at the very beginning of their journey as a scholar. In the end, there really was no right or wrong. One could educate the masses, spread their teachings to the world, or simply go into seclusion to lead a peaceful life. Ultimately, it was all down to personal preference. The old monk wore a tranquil expression, and after hearing Chan Pingin's preaching, he joined his palms together and lowered his head as he murmured, "Umitba." Chan Pingin turned his gaze to the little oriole that was perched on the roof, which was watching the young monk as he swept the courtyard. As he looked back at the old monk, the latter smiled and said, "Even if the temple is gone, the monks will remain. Even if the monks are gone, the scriptures will remain. Even if the scriptures are gone, the Buddha remains. Even if the Buddha is gone, his teachings remain. Even if there comes a day where not a single monk or scripture is left in Heart Manifestation Temple. As long as people still hold the teachings of Buddhism dear to their hearts, Heart Manifestation Temple will continue to exist." The old man turned to the peaceful courtyard once again, and the only sound that could be heard came from the young monk's sweeping broom. "I can see a lotus flower blooming in the world," the old monk murmured as his eyes began to lose focus. Chan Pingin remained silent. "It's my time," the old monk murmured as he lowered his head. The young monk sweeping the courtyard turned to the abbot as he complained from afar. "Master, the sun is so bright right now, can I sweep the courtyard a little later? I'm about to die from heat stroke." Chan Pingin turned to the young monk and placed a finger over his own lips in a silencing gesture while pointing at the old monk, who seemed to be taking a nap. The young monk hurriedly fell silent, then began to giggle silently to himself. "It looks like Master also likes to slack off and take naps just like me." He snuck over to the shade cast by the eave of the main hall, and the little oriole mustered up some courage to fly onto his shoulder. The young monk faltered slightly, then abruptly turned his head to make a scary face at the little oriole, startling it into flying away in a panic. The young monk looked on at the fleeing bird with a dazed expression, then rubbed his own bald head with a slightly guilty look in his eyes. On the woven cushion, the deceased old monk remained in a loose and relaxed seated position. Looking at the old monk, Chan Pingin suddenly thought of something that Lu Tai had said to him. "Death is but an eternal nap." The little monk was very distraught upon learning of his master's death, displaying none of the tranquility and detachment preached by Buddhist monks. However, as Chan Pingin watched the bawling little boy vigorously shaking the old monk's arm from side to side, as if he were trying to rouse his master from his slumber, Chan Pingin felt as if this was the reaction most fitting for a boy with human emotions. After learning that his master's body was cremated into Sariras, the little monk's depression turned to elation, and he felt very proud of his master. Once again, the little monk's propensity for wild emotional fluctuations was very unbefitting of a Buddhist monk. Chan Pingin had been helping the temple wherever he could during the transition period in the wake of the old monk's passing. He informed the new abbot in private of the old monk's intention to keep the matter regarding the Sariras a secret for now, at least until this recent wave of controversy blew over. The new abbot raised no objections to this, and he thanked Chan Pingin earnestly for informing him of the old abbot's final wishes. After that, Chan Pingin paid no further visits to Heart Manifestation Temple, but he told the new abbot that if Heart Manifestation Temple were to ever run into any trouble, then he could send a messenger to his current residence, and he would be sure to help out wherever he could. The new abbot thanked him once again, and following Chan Pingin's departure, He went to the main hall and lit an eternal flame lantern for the kind-hearted benefactor. He then called over the little monk and instructed him to frequently check on the lantern. The little monk nodded in response, but judging from how quickly he had agreed, the abbot knew that the little monk was definitely going to slack off. Hence, he flicked the little monk gently on the head and reiterated, "I'm serious, Muyu. Make sure the lantern doesn't go out." The little monk nodded once again with a sullen expression. The residual sharp pain from that flick to the forehead served as good an impetus as any for him to remember to take this matter seriously. It then occurred to him that he was his master's youngest disciple, so he was never going to have any junior brothers, and that was a horrifying realization for him. With that in mind, he immediately darted away like the wind, catching up to his senior brother before asking him when he was going to be taking disciples. The abbot could tell what the little monk was thinking, and an exasperated look appeared on his face as he prepared to flick the little monk on the head once again, much like he would strike a normal wooden fish. The little monk heaved a forlorn sigh before rushing away again. Strangely enough, even though Chan Pingan's mental state was gradually returning to tranquility, he didn't resume his practice of the mountain-shaking guide and the proper sword scripture. Instead, he continued to wander around in the capital city, this time with a small cotton pouch on his back. He had a diet of wine and dry biscuits, and he had no set place of residence, stopping at any peaceful location that he took a liking to whenever he needed to rest, whether that be under the shade of a tree, on a rooftop, or beside a river. He passed by tall red walls with the canopies of trees peeking over them, and he could hear the sounds of children playing and laughing within the walls. There was a group of well-dressed scholars reciting beautiful poems, and at the time, Chan Pingan had been seated on a branch of a nearby tree, drinking in silence. There was a waterside restaurant where a gathering of friends was taking place. All of them were handsome young intellectuals, and they were discussing the state of the world and exchanging opinions on the policies of the nation. Chan Pingan was seated on the rooftop of the restaurant, listening intently to their conversation. They were full of ambition and detested evil with all their hearts, but Chan Pingan felt like the political reforms that they proposed were going to be difficult to execute in practice. Having said that, it could also just be because these young intellectuals hadn't gone into detail about their ideas as they had had too much to drink. There were two gangs that had agreed to meet up for a fight. Each gang had 30 to 40 men, and they had decided to settle their differences here once and for all. Chan Pingan observed the scuffle while squatting atop a collapsed wall in the distance, and he noticed that the older men above 20 years of age were very wily and cunning in the way that they fought, while the young men below 20 years of age fought with reckless abandon and brutality. After the event, they walked away bruised and battered while leaning on their brothers for support, and they were already looking forward to the next fight. The leader of one of the gangs was slightly older, close to 30 years of age, and he arranged for all of his brothers to go and have a drink together at a wine shop. The beautiful woman at the counter was the man's wife, and she could only force a smile at the sight of these familiar faces, then bring out some food and wine for her husband's brothers. The man was surrounded by his brothers, talking in an animated fashion, while the woman looked on at him with a hint of concern in her eyes, as if she was wondering how she was going to make ends meet, but there was also a look of admiration on her face whenever she gazed upon him. The woman was watching her husband, while her husband's right-hand man, the most courageous and skilled fighter among the man's subordinates, was sneaking furtive glances at her. Chan Pingan sat at the table furthest away from them and ordered 2 flagons of wine, one to pour into his sword-nurturing gourd, and the other to drink right away. The young woman gritted her teeth and decided to overcharge him, asking for 30 extra copper coins. Thankfully for her, Chan Pingan didn't seem to know the local wine prices, and he paid without any hesitation. The woman was left feeling a little guilty, so she brought him a couple of dishes of appetizers that she had made, in response to which Chan Pingan stood up to thank her with a smile. This made the woman feel even more guilty and embarrassed, and she hurriedly turned away, not daring to look into Chan Pingan's clean and pure eyes any longer. Over at the other table, everyone was gathered around the leader of the gang, whose cheeks were rosy red from the wine that he had drunk, and he was loudly telling his brothers that someday, they were going to truly have a territory of their own in the capital city. Once that time came, they would drink wine and eat meat to their heart's content, and they would no longer have to be fearful of official soldiers with sabers strapped to their waists. In fact, those soldiers were going to be the ones to suck up to them, and Scholar Ma would never dare to look down on them again whenever they asked him to write some couplets for them in the future. The man was tripping over his words a little from inebriation, but all of his brothers were still cheering loudly at the vision that he had presented to them. In particular, the younger members of the gang drank until they threw up, only to repeat the cycle again, and when they returned to the table, they could still make out their brothers through their bleary, drunken eyes. To them, they couldn't imagine a better life to lead. Chun Ping'an left the street-side wine shop in silence. As he did so, he couldn't help but turn back to look at the table of men, and he was reminded of the time that he had spent with Lu Xianying and Gu Can. At the time, he was still working as an apprentice in the dragon kiln, and with Lu Xianying's meager income, he was barely able to afford any wine to drink. After having a drink, Lu Xianying would routinely speak about his grand visions for the future, following which he would grumble about why Zhigui didn't seem to like him. As for Gu Can, he had always been mature beyond his years, and he would grit his teeth and imitate the thugs that he had seen in the past, talking about how he was going to throw caution to the wind, exact vengeance on everyone who had wronged him in the past. After a while, Chun Ping'an departed, and one of the more observant young men said in a joking manner, "That pretty boy from earlier was looking at us for quite a while before he left. Could it be that he's taken a liking to our boss lady?" The inebriated man slammed his fist onto the table as he roared, "I'll kill him if he dares to look at my wife. Let me tell you this. Even if I die tomorrow, my wife will remain a widow for the rest of her life and won't ever remarry, even if the emperor offers to take her as a concubine. That little pretty boy has nothing on me. Does he think he's top shit just because he's carrying a sword?" The man's head dropped onto the table with a loud thump as he spoke, and he immediately began snoring. The young woman lowered her head as she wiped down a table, and for some reason, a faint smile appeared on her face. The young man, constantly stealing glances at the woman, had also lowered his head, a little in panic and a little in resentment. He took a sip of wine, but it was completely bland and tasteless. There was a frail and weary-looking woman who chased a naughty child onto the street for some reason, and as soon as she caught him, she began to administer a spanking. The boy pretended to howl in pain, but was actually making funny faces at one of his nearby friends. As the frail-looking woman beat the child, she suddenly erupted into tears herself, and only then did the boy also begin to genuinely cry. After a bout of heavy rain, the warmth of the sun's rays finally returned to the capital city. A group of well-dressed individuals were galloping along on horseback, and the thundering hooves of their steeds were sending mud splattering in all directions. There was a street-side stall being run by an old woman, and she was selling some crudely knitted garments. Before she had a chance to do anything, her wares had become splattered with mud, and a distraught look instantly appeared on her face. Riding at the end of the group was a proud-looking young woman, and upon noticing the old woman's heartbroken expression, she casually tossed a pouch of money onto the stall while continuing to ride onward. However, her horsemanship was far from exceptional, and as she focused on tossing the pouch of money onto the stall, she inadvertently fell off the back of her steed, tumbling to the ground before rising to her feet with a groan and a grimace. Her beautiful features and expensive dress were all covered in mud. The woman stumbled over to her horse, which had stopped in its tracks to wait for its rider, and she clambered onto its back with some difficulty before setting off again. As she did so, she noticed a white-robed swordsman out of the corner of her eye. The white-robed figure was standing on the side of the street, and she couldn't help but turn to look at him, upon which he gave her a thumbs up. The young woman rolled her eyes and moved on without giving the interaction a second thought. Thus, Chun Ping'an continued his leisurely journey, witnessing many different sights and scenes in the process. The controversy of White River Temple quickly blew over in less than 10 days, and the imperial court had already closed the case. Several of the main perpetrators behind the temple's crimes had been executed, while the rest had all been imprisoned or banished. The properties of White River Temple had all been confiscated, and as for who was going to take over the temple, some speculated that it would be one of the other 3 major temples in the capital city, while others claimed that it would be one of the renowned temples outside of the capital city. Clearly, there was a very capable and wise figure offering the Emperor of Southern Garden Nation counsel on this matter, and the controversy of White River Temple died down very quickly as the attention of the entire nation was quickly turned to another important event. one of the four grandmasters, faction master Eugenie of the Lake Mountain faction, had successfully made a breakthrough after 10 years of seclusion, and he was holding a martial gathering, calling upon all of the nation's top martial artists to discuss the matter of eradicating the three devilish sections. The number one martial artist under the heavens, Imperial Preceptor Zhong Qiu, Tong Qingqing of the Mirror Heart Hall, and Mountain Master Lu Feng of the Bird's Eye View Peak were all set to make an appearance at the gathering. The four grandmasters were going to be coming together on Bull Mountain, which was situated right next to Southern Garden Nation's capital city, and this was going to be a grand event the likes of which the nation hadn't seen for over 100 years. These four people each stood at the pinnacle of the martial arts world of their respective nation, and they possessed incredible power and influence. In particular, Imperial Preceptor Zhong Qiu of Southern Garden Nation and Eugenie of Pinesong Nation had history with each other dating back to over 60 years ago. Both of them had come from humble backgrounds in Pinesong Nation, and they had been neighbors growing up. As a pair of inseparable friends, they began to travel the world together, and each of them encountered their own fated opportunities, elevating them to become a pair of vastly renowned martial arts prodigies. However, for some reason, the two of them turned on each other, and following a mortal duel that was witnessed by only 4 or 5 people, both of them sustained severe injuries. After that, Zhong Qiu arrived in Southern Garden Nation, and the two of them cut all ties with each other, marking the end of their tumultuous and rather confounding relationship. Under the dying light of dusk, Qian Ping'an returned to the house where he was staying near Champion Scholar Alley. Prior to this, he had spotted the grandfather and grandson duo watching others play Go on a corner of a street, and upon catching sight of Qian Ping'an, a fearful look immediately appeared on the boy's face. He hurriedly rose to his feet and beckoned Qian Ping'an over to come and watch the game with him. Qian Ping'an duly obliged, but after watching the game together for a while, the boy declared that he had to do something back home, and he promptly ran away. Qian Ping'an didn't have much interest in watching the game, so after standing there for a few minutes, he returned to the house as well. After Qian Ping'an entered his room, the boy got up onto a little stool so that he could peer through the window across at Qian Ping'an's room from his own, and he heaved a faint sigh of relief. Qian Ping'an closed the door, then set down his bag onto the bed, upon which the little lotus figure immediately sprang out of the ground and began gesturing in an angry fashion while making a string of unintelligible sounds. Qian Ping'an took a glance at the pile of books on his desk, and he noticed that they were clearly a little more creased than when he left the house. He immediately realized why the little lotus figure was so angry, and he crouched down before spreading a hand open, allowing the little lotus figure to climb onto the palm of his hand. After that, he sat down at the desk, and the little lotus figure immediately jumped onto the pile of books, then knelt down onto the cover of one of the books to carefully smooth down the creases on it with its little hands. "It's all right, books are meant to be read." He returned the books, did he not? "So there's no need to be angry," Qian Ping'an said with a smile. The little lotus figure stopped what it was doing as it turned to Qian Ping'an with a perplexed expression. Qian Ping'an gave it a gentle pat on the head, then pulled out his bamboo slip and carving knife before setting them down onto the table. That night, Qian Ping'an made a secret visit to White River Temple. He had offered up incense at the temple in the past, so it wasn't an unfamiliar place to him. There was a hall in White River Temple that was very peculiar in that there were 3 Buddha statues being worshipped inside. There was one that wore a furious expression, one that had its head lowered in a timid fashion, and the one at the center was seated with its back facing the hall. Over the temple's 1,000-year history, it had always had its back to the temple's visitors. Recently, things had been a little depressing at White River Temple. It barely received any visitors during the day, and it was even more deathly quiet here at night. On top of that, many terrifying rumors about the temple had been circulating in the capital city of late, and in light of the recent controversy, the revered Buddha statues were suddenly looking a lot more sinister. A few days ago, a group of thieves had entered the temple to see if they could find anything of value, and all of them had fled the temple while screaming at the top of their lungs, looking utterly insane. Only after all of them were locked up in prison cells did they finally calm down, upon which they proclaimed that there were ghosts in White River Temple. Qian Ping'an entered a side hall through the door that was still ajar, then lit a yang energy illumination talisman to check if there were any sinister forces present. He shuffled his way to several spots in the temple, but the talisman only continued to burn at an even pace, indicating that nothing was amiss. Right as he was planning to leave the temple, he suddenly sprang up into the air, landing on one of the horizontal beams in the hall before laying down on his side and concealing his own aura. 3 figures swaggered their way into the hall from outside, and they looked much more like affluent individuals out on a moonlit stroll than a group of thieves. Chen Ping'an's brows furrowed slightly at the sight of the trio. He had seen 2 of them in the past as they were among the martial artists living in that quiet residence on Champion Scholar Alley. One of them was a tall and thin elderly man who wasn't a Taoist priest, but was wearing an antiquated silver-colored lotus flower hat. In contrast with the time when Chen Ping'an had watched him from afar, the old man wasn't bothering to conceal his own aura at all on this occasion, and as soon as he strode over the doorstep, it felt as if a huge mountain had crashed its way into the temple. He was accompanied by a woman, who removed her veiled hat to reveal a set of stunning facial features. She then also took off her cloak, which was concealing her exceptional figure, and she was wearing a pair of wooden clogs on her fair and delicate feet. The final person to round out the trio was a tall and handsome young man wearing a loose-fitting dark green robe. He was holding a set of coral prayer beads, which he was gently massaging as he walked. The woman had a crisp and pleasant voice, and she didn't speak in the dialect of Southern Garden Nation's capital city. She took a seductive glance at the young man as she jibed. "Aren't you supposed to be a devout Buddhist, Zhou Shi? Why aren't you kneeling down to kowtow? Once you do, I'll sneak over to the Buddha statue, and I'll be able to proclaim to the entire world that the prestigious young Master Zhou knelt down and kowtowed to me. I'll become a household name across the entire world overnight." Zhou Shi merely smiled and offered no response as he looked up at the 3 Buddha statues. It was completely silent in the hall with the exception of the faint sound produced by his rolling prayer beads. "Don't make fun of Zhou Shi. You're lucky that he's a tolerant man who doesn't anger easily. Otherwise, if he turns on you and insists on fighting you to the death, which of us is going to pay for his coffin?" The old man chuckled. Despite her youthful appearance, Yora had the seductive charm of a mature woman, and an amused smile appeared on her face as she illuminated the dark and eerie hall with her stunning beauty. Eugenie of the Lake Mountain faction, Zhong Qiu of Southern Garden Nation, Tong Qingqing of Mirror Heart Pavilion, and Lu Feng of Bird's Eye View Peak are all powerful immortals. In particular, Tong Qingqing is from the same generation as you. We're far too weak compared to them. Is it really a good idea to be doing something so risky? Even if we manage to secure the golden Arhat body and that scripture, will we be able to leave this city alive? The young woman asked in a concerned voice as she turned to the old man. While it's true that you're really the one who's most powerful under the heavens, you can't take on all of them at once. Eugenie has so many disciples and grand-disciples, and we're on Zhongqiu's territory right now in Southern Garden Nation. On top of that, Tong Qingqing is an old seductress who loves to win others over with her charm. Last time, Zhou Shi returned with those severe injuries and told us that he was almost beaten to death by Tong Qingqing. But who's to say that he hasn't fallen for the old witch and was only putting on an act? Then there's Lu Feng, who's only been in a handful of battles the past few decades. Everyone says that he's a grandmaster who walks the righteous path, and that alone is a clear indication of how exceptional his aptitude is. After so many years of cultivation, perhaps he's already surpassed both Eugenie and Zhongqiu. The old man merely ignored her as he stood with his hands clasped behind his back, facing the Buddha statues in silence. The young woman wasn't very pleased, and she stomped her foot, causing the bottom of her wooden clog to clack audibly on the stone ground. The bond between those 4 isn't that strong. When faced with life-threatening peril, I don't think any of them would be willing to sacrifice themselves for the greater good, Zhou Shi consoled. You make it sound like one of us would be willing to do that, the young woman countered. Zhou Shi wasn't bothered by the young woman's confrontational tone, and he continued, We have my father, armed sage Cheng Yuanshan, and knife sharpener Lu Zong, so in terms of top-tier strength, we don't lose to the 4 grandmasters. On top of that, this is a secret operation, not a battle between 2 armies on the battlefield, so there's no need to worry too much about how we match up overall against our opponents. In reality, the concept of the 4 grandmasters was one that was only championed by those who walked the path of righteousness, and it intentionally excluded all of the leading figures of the devilish path. Essentially, it was just something that they had made up to boost their own morale. What was taken far more seriously was the all-encompassing upper 10 elites, of which the righteous and devilish paths each claimed 5 spots. Of course, the 4 grandmasters were all among the upper 10 elites, with Eugenie ranked 2nd, Zhongqiu ranked 6th, Tong Qingqing ranked 9th, and Lu Feng ranked 10th. However, with the passage of time, almost everyone was now convinced that Lu Feng was the one who had the best chance of dethroning the figure at the top of the list. There were even some who were of the opinion that Lu Feng had already surpassed Zhongqiu, and deserved to rank among the top 5. As for the 3 people that Zhou Shi had mentioned, armed sage Chang Yuanshan was an extremely formidable martial artist, but all of his battles were to the death. Hence, he wasn't acknowledged by any righteous factions, and was denied the title of Grandmaster for his terrible martial virtue. He was ranked 8th among the upper 10 elites. Knife sharpener Lu Zong was a top-tier demonic cultivator, and he was notorious for his bloodlust. He was ranked 7th. As for Zhou Shi's father Zhou Fei, he was a devilish cultivator who countless orthodox figures were dreaming of killing someday. He was an exceptional martial artist, but his martial arts ability was matched only by his horrendous character. He had a spring-tide palace where he kept a harem of hundreds of beautiful women from all over the world, and he and his sons were the only men in the palace. Presiding over this palace, Zhou Fei declared himself an immortal emperor. However, what was most frustrating to everyone was that Zhou Fei was ranked 4th on the list, and he was widely acknowledged as the number 1 martial artist under the heavens. Some years ago, Lu Feng had successfully impaled Zhou Fei's body thrice with his sword, but Zhou Fei remained completely unaffected, able to continue battling as normal, and in the wake of this, Lu Feng retreated. On that occasion, Lu Feng had stormed into the spring-tide palace on his own, and he had paid a massive price for that rash decision. During a 3-year-long journey that he took, all 600 members of his sect were slowly tormented to death by Zhou Fei in a horrific display completely unbefitting a martial artist of his caliber. It was said that even to this day, Lu Feng's mistress and over 10 of his senior and junior sisters were still forced to serve at the Spring-Tide Palace. As for why Lu Feng didn't challenge Zhou Fei once again after returning from his journey and hearing the terrible news, that became one of the 4 biggest mysteries of the martial arts world, alongside the questions of just how powerful the first-ranked devilish cultivator in the upper 10 elites was, how beautiful Tong Qingqing of Mirror Heart Pavilion was, and what age was Eugenie going to live to. All types of strange happenings were taking place on the route from Bull Mountain to the capital city of Southern Garden Nation. There was a middle-aged man who traveled from afar to the capital city, and he was already severely inebriated upon arriving at the city. In the city, he continued to drink without restraint, constantly laying on the street in a drunken stupor. In the end, he was forced to pawn his sword to the wine shop for 5 taels of silver, and that was only because he was quite a muscular man, and the female shopkeeper was able to feel up his muscles a little whenever he was unconscious. Otherwise, he would have only been able to pawn the sword for 3 taels of silver at the very most. On the summit of Bull Mountain was a man with a set of pure facial features, and a body that looked as if it belonged to a child. Whenever he had some spare time, he would carefully polish a jade and bamboo folding fan. Despite his youthful appearance, he was respectfully referred to as Old Grandmaster Yu by Southern Garden Nation General overseeing the 800 Imperial Guards at the foot of the mountain. There was a hunchbacked elderly man who served as head chef in the prince's manor. He removed the lid from a large vat of pickled vegetables that still weren't ready yet, and a sour smell instantly spread through the entire room as he murmured about how there was much unrest in the air. However, out of all of these people, the 3 that were in White River Temple on this night were the most important. The old man's surname was Ding, and he didn't have much relation to the young woman and Zhou Shi. Over the past 80 years, he had firmly held down the position of the most powerful figure under the heavens, and he killed purely depending on his mood and whims. He killed renowned scholars, emperors and generals, evildoers in the martial arts world, random elders, women and children, and he passed down his position of sect master to his only remaining disciple that he hadn't killed, then vanished into thin air. However, during the evaluation that took place 20 years after he faded from the public eye, he was still the undisputed most powerful figure under the heavens. There was a very amusing rumor circulating in the martial arts world pertaining to the Reverence Pagoda, which specialized in gathering intelligence and ranking the powerful figures of the world. Close friends of the past two pagoda masters had asked them why they hadn't removed the old man with the Ding surname from the top of the list, seeing as it wasn't clear whether he was even still alive, and both of them had replied in an identical fashion. If he's not dead, then I will be if I do that. Inside the hall, the young woman smiled as she asked, Your father is the one who's making the biggest contribution to the cause, yet all he asked for is celestial maiden Zhou. Does he really not feel like he's getting the short end of the stick? A wry smile appeared on Zhou Shi's face as he sighed. You know what my father is like. If you want to paint him in a good light, then you could say that he's an appreciator of beauty, but if you want to be blunt about it, then he's really just obsessed with beautiful women. If it wasn't for the fact that Zhongqiu is living right next to Southern Garden Nation's imperial palace, I wouldn't put it past him to storm into the palace to abduct Empress Fan. The young woman rubbed her own face as she sighed. Zhou Shuzhen and Fan Wan'er, one of them is the current most beautiful woman under the heavens, while the other held the title 20 years ago. Your father really does have high standards. It's no wonder that I haven't been able to catch his eye. Even when we meet and have tea together, he remains so polite and professional. A wry smile appeared on Zhou Shi's face upon hearing this. Why isn't your father going after Tong Qingqing? The young woman asked with a smile. Zhou Shi was looking up at the Buddha statue with a furious expression, and he continued to massage his prayer beads as he replied, My father says that if a meal is sufficiently delectable, then even if it's so hot that it would burn his mouth to the point of blisters, he would still be willing to scarf it down. However, if a meal is going to kill you, then you must resist it no matter how tantalizing it is. A mocking sneer appeared on the old man's face, and he took a glance at his surroundings then said, Let's go. The godly body is no longer here. The young woman and Zhou Shi had no objections to this, nor did they dare to raise any. Despite how she affectionately referred to the old man as Grand Teacher, she was actually extremely fearful around him, constantly worried that the old man would smash her head open at the slightest transgression, and the same applied to Zhou Shi as well. Being Zhou Fei's son, he had some form of protection, but he knew that if he were to irk the old man, then he would still be killed without any hesitation. Every single one of the old man's movements seemed to comply with the natural order, and as he was about to stride over the doorstep, he suddenly paused ever so slightly. It was a seemingly trivial gesture, but it was enough to make Zhou Shi and the young woman begin sweating profusely, and they instantly stopped in their tracks. The old man sped up a little as he strode over the doorstep before making his way down the stairs. Zhou Shi and the young woman were both martial arts prodigies who had earned themselves a great deal of renown in the martial arts world. But at this moment, they were trailing along behind the old man like a pair of puppets on strings. The old man took a glance up at the moon, then smiled as he remarked, This city is a far more interesting place than it was 60 years ago. Zhou Shi and the young woman exchanged a glance, and both of them felt like there was more to that statement than met the eye. Following the trio's departure, Chen Ping'an got up into a seated posture on the horizontal beam, then brought his palms together as if he were apologizing to the three Buddha statues for his disrespectful gesture. The old man with the Ding surname was quite formidable, so he had no choice but to hide. All of a sudden, Chen Ping'an laid back down again as two more figures entered the hall like a wisp of smoke. It was a man and a woman, and the woman was even more stunning than the young woman from earlier, while the man appeared to be in his early 30s. He was extremely handsome, dressed in refined attire, and there was an air of regal authority intermingled with graceful elegance about him. A smile appeared on his face as he said in an authentic capital city dialect, That old man really is rather enigmatic, celestial maiden Fan. He clearly noticed us earlier, yet he didn't do anything. The woman resembled an orchid blooming in the mountain wilderness, and she was so stunningly beautiful that it was downright unfair. The average beauty would instantly be struck by a sense of inferiority upon catching sight of her, while the average man wouldn't even be able to muster up the desire to possess her, knowing that she was too far out of reach. He didn't do anything because he didn't regard us as threats, the woman replied. The man smiled as he asked, Are you saying that I wouldn't even have been able to withstand a single attack from him? Surely not. My master is among the small handful of people closest to the upper 10 elites, and right now my chances of victory in sparring matches against my master are as high as 20% to 30%. The woman shook her head in response. Of course, you possess exceptional aptitude, Your Highness, but a battle of life and death between master martial artists can't compare with casual sparring matches between master and student. Do not underestimate anyone. Even if you're facing a second-rate opponent, make sure you don't let your guard down until they're well and truly dead. The man construed the woman's words as an expression of concern, and he was very pleased that she was concerned for him. However, as a prince, he had developed a habit of concealing his emotions from a very young age, so he merely gave a slight nod as he smiled and replied, "I'll make sure to keep that in mind. Whenever I engage in battle in the future, I'll carefully think back to what you said to me before I make a move." The woman merely smiled and offered no response. It was clear that the man was flirting very subtly with her, but for a seasoned veteran who had been traveling the world on her own for 6 years, she paid no heed to his advances, and she certainly wasn't reciprocating his feelings. All of a sudden, a cold look appeared on her face as she yelled, "Come out!" The man was quite startled by her sudden outburst. If there were someone hiding here, then the fact that he had failed to detect them up to this point indicated that they were at least on par in power with the two of them. He and the woman both scoured the hall together, and a moment later, the woman heaved a sigh of relief as she smiled and said, "Pardon me for startling you, Your Highness, but it's always better to be safe than sorry." The man was very relieved to hear this, and an amused look appeared on his face as he turned and cupped his fist in a salute. "You've taught me yet another valuable lesson, Celestial Maiden Fan." The woman smiled in response, and the two of them searched the area around the 3 Buddha statues, but just like the trio that had come before them, they didn't discover anything worthy of note, so they departed as well. Shortly after their departure, a burst of ripples surged through the air above a horizontal beam, and a flash of white gradually emerged. As it turned out, Chen Ping'an had expanded his Dao robe so that he could conceal himself within it. It was a rather crude concealment method that Chen Ping'an had thought of himself, and it was quite practical, but it was a little lacking in flair and elegance as he was essentially just hiding in a self-created shell. Chen Ping'an sat on the horizontal beam and was just about to remove the sword-nurturing gourd from his waist to take a drink, but he then realized that he was in a Buddhist temple, so he hurriedly stopped what he was doing, then drifted down onto the ground to leave. He had only just arrived at the doorstep of the hall when he spotted the woman with the Fan surname from earlier staring coldly at him from afar. Chen Ping'an stopped in his tracks, and the woman continued to stare at him, but didn't say anything or lash out. Chen Ping'an was feeling a little disgruntled. "What the hell are you looking at? I already have a girl that I like, and she's better looking than you. At least that's what I think. You're quite beautiful yourself, but that doesn't give you an excuse to just gawk at me like an idiot." Chen Ping'an didn't want to waste any more time here with her, and he was worried that it wouldn't be easy to escape this place on foot, so he used an inch movement talisman, abruptly vanishing from the spot. The woman's mouth gaped open slightly in astonishment, and she began to wonder if she had unknowingly run into some obscure master. Not long after Chen Ping'an left White River Temple, his attention was drawn to a lively and bustling street. In particular, he was drawn to the rich aromas wafting out of the street, and he went to a stall and ordered a hot and spicy dish. As he was eating, he noticed that once again, there was a beautiful woman gawking at him. It was the same woman with the Fan surname, and at first glance it appeared that her attire was quite simple and modest, but upon closer inspection, one would notice that there were elegant clouds embroidered onto her clothes, and they were just barely visible under the light of the moon and the nearby lanterns. It was a very refined and understated display of wealth. However, at this moment, she appeared to be wearing a disguise that masked much of her beauty, so she didn't attract too much attention from the bystanders nearby. She was still staring intently at Chen Ping'an, who set down his bowl and chopsticks in exasperation as he asked, "Can I help you?" All of a sudden, she raised a hand to rub her own forehead, then looked around with a furrowed brow. A conflict had arisen between some people at a neighboring table, and they were hurling abuse at one another while slamming the table. One of them was pointing at the nose of the other while denouncing all of the women in his family as sluts and prostitutes, and that his house may as well have been a brothel. Both were speaking with a strong Southern Garden Nation capital dialect, and they were being extremely vulgar and crass. The woman gently massaged her own temples for a moment to compose herself, then turned back to Chen Ping'an with a look of intrigue and admiration in her eyes as she asked through voice transmission, "Young master, are you by any chance an otherworldly immortal?" Chan Ping'an was very amused to hear this, and he shook his head as he replied, "I'm not an otherworldly immortal, I'm just an outsider traveling through Southern Garden Nation." A disappointed look appeared on the woman's face, and she said in an apologetic manner, "Please pardon my intrusion." The woman hesitated momentarily, then continued, "The capital has not been a very safe place of late. Someone of your exceptional talents could easily become a target, so do be careful." "Thank you for looking out for me, Miss Fan," Chan Ping'an replied as he cupped his fist in a salute. Fan Wanner wasn't the type to prolong unnecessary interactions, and she promptly departed without another word. Some young thugs tried to grab her as she passed by, but she was able to evade them with ease, much like a fish in water swimming through their grasping hands in an agile fashion. Chan Ping'an was feeling rather perplexed. According to Cui Chan's grandfather, one's martial arts aptitude could be gleaned from whether they were able to derive the most profound fist intent from the lowliest of fist techniques, and that was one of the reasons why he had chosen Chan Ping'an. However, the old man was very stubborn and refused to admit that the mountain-shaking fist actually had many strong points, and Chan Ping'an didn't want to expose him. This woman was most likely Fan Wanner, and judging from what Chan Ping'an had overheard from Zhou Shi, and the old man with the Ding surname, she seemed to be comparable to someone like He Xiaoyang back on Eastern Treasured Vile Continent. Fan Wanner was clearly already displaying signs of approaching the Great Tao, but for some reason, her martial arts cultivation base was unable to improve, as if there were a massive mountain weighing down upon it, inhibiting its growth. One could conceal one's aura to condense their cultivation base and strive for a stronger foundation, but over time telltale signs would begin to emerge, even from actions as mundane as taking a breath or lifting a finger. Earlier, the old man with the Ding surname appeared to have been quite casual as he made his way into White River Temple, but Chan Ping'an was immediately able to sense the stirring of heaven and earth. Having emerged from Jewel's small world, Chan Ping'an had witnessed more than his fair share of unfathomably powerful figures, so someone that even he regarded as powerful was definitely no slouch. After all, his fist technique instructor was a martial artist who had once been at the pinnacle of the 10th tier, while his sword technique mentor was an old golden core tier swordsman. Following Fan Wanner's departure, Chan Ping'an also left the bustling market shortly thereafter. Southern Garden Nation's capital city was split up into 81 areas of different sizes, and the general layout was much the same compared with many of the nations that Chan Ping'an had passed through. The northern part of the city was quite wealthy, while the south was impoverished, and the east was filled with martial artists, while the west was primarily inhabited by scholars. White River Temple was situated in the western part of the city, which was home to the manors of many mid-level scholarly officials and wealthy merchants. At this moment, Chan Ping'an was walking on a stone arch bridge. It was a peaceful night, and he jumped onto the railing of the bridge, walking along it to the other side of the bridge before looking down at the river beneath his feet. There was a flood dragon-like water guardian beast down below, which was quite a common sight at Rivers 1. There were many such water guardian beasts in many of Eastern Treasured Vile Continent's more opulent cities, and they were usually positioned near bridges to subjugate the spirits in the water. However, Chan Ping'an wasn't able to sense any spiritual energy in this ancient water guardian beast, indicating to him that it was only there for show. While Chan Ping'an was staring into the water in a daze, Fan Wanner ran into Prince Wei Yan, who was supposed to have been on his way back to the Southern Garden Nation's imperial palace. Despite his noble status, Wei Yan was also a young martial artist master. His martial arts teacher was a master from an older generation who had fled to Southern Garden Nation from the north. Just as Wei Yan had said, his master was among the small handful of people closest to the upper 10 elites. Additionally, Wei Yan's master also had a vendetta against the Hanging Flower faction, one of the 3 devilish sects. Hence, as his disciple, Wei Yan was thought of by the Lake Mountain faction and the Mirror Heart Pavilion as one who walked the righteous path, and that he had hopes of becoming a leading figure in the martial arts world in the future. In fact, the Mirror Heart Pavilion even had intentions of helping him become the next emperor of Southern Garden Nation. The young woman by the name of Yuer was supporting Wei Yan's younger brother, Wei Chong, in secret. The two of them had been constantly at each other's throats, fighting over the favor of the old emperor for the past 5 or 6 years. Fan Wanner and Wei Yan were strolling through the peaceful night when Wei Yan said, "If you wanted to meet that person, then there was no need to keep it a secret from me, Celestial Maiden Fan." The fact that he was able to hide in White River Temple and avoid our detection the entire time indicates that he's clearly not just some ordinary martial artist. If he had been a devilish cultivator, then you could have easily placed yourself in harm's way by going to see him on your own. Fan Wanner smiled as she said, "Right now there are 10 prominent figures in our younger generation, namely you and me, Qing Yue, Zhou Shi of the Springtide Palace, and 6 other young martial artists of a similar age to us. In a way, we're almost a reflection of the current upper 10 elites. Out of all of us, who do you think is the most formidable martial artist?" Wei Yan already knew the answer to this question. Not only did he have a good master, he was also the prince of a nation, and he had spies feeding him intelligence from all over the world. Hence, even though he hadn't traveled much of the world himself, he knew many secrets that others didn't, and he didn't even have to think before he replied. It's hard to say who's at the very top, but there's a common consensus on who occupies the top 3 spots. In a battle of life and death, the one who comes out on top will be the one who can derive the most advantage from certain internal and external factors. Wei Yan took a glance at Fan Wanner as he spoke, and he noticed that she wasn't carrying a weapon. He smiled as he continued, "You're very well versed with the teachings of the Mirror Heart Pavilion and the Lake Mountain faction, as well as the long-lost White Ape sword-carrying technique. With all of your talents, you are definitely worthy of a spot in the top 3. My master once told me that you can be 2 completely different people depending on whether you have a sword on your back." "You're far too kind, Your Highness," Fan Wanner said with a smile. Wei Yan clasped one hand behind his back while gently tapping the jade belt around his waist with the fingers of his other hand as he continued. Back when Yura first came to the capital city, she had been extremely arrogant and provoked the Imperial Preceptor. She withstood a punch from the Imperial Preceptor and was able to survive, albeit with some injuries. Everyone thought that she was merely fortunate to have survived that encounter, but my father told me that our Imperial Preceptor once proclaimed that Yura possessed tremendous martial arts aptitude, likening her to a female Lu Feng. As for the final person to round out the top 3, that would have to be Feng Qingbai. Over the past decade or so, he's been on a meteoric rise, but nothing is known about his past, his origins, and which powers he's affiliated with. He likes to travel to all parts and challenge all types of different martial arts masters, and he's been improving at a rapid rate. One can tell from the opponents that he's selected that in the short span of just a decade, he's grown from a complete novice to a first-rate elite martial artist. Wei Yan paused here momentarily, then turned to Fan Wanner before asking, "Is there anyone else I should know about in the remaining 7? Fan Wanner clasped her hands behind her back as she strolled over a small bridge, approaching the railing before patting the head of the small stone lion engraved there as she replied, "If there is, then at the very least, I don't know about them, nor does our Mirror Heart Pavilion." Wei Yan never expected there to be such a cheeky and mischievous side to Fan Wanner, and he couldn't help but momentarily transfixed as he gazed upon her. When it came to judging female beauty, the average man would only look at a woman's face and figure, while those with more refined taste appraised a woman's aura. Fan Wanner was exceptional in all 3 accounts, so it was no wonder that the proud and noble prince of Southern Garden Nation had fallen for her. Wei Yan had always made sure to be respectful around Fan Wanner, whether that be with his words and actions, or with his gaze, but he had never tried to hide his feelings for her either. He stopped in his tracks, then sped up so that he could walk alongside her, and he wanted to grab onto her delicate hand, but didn't have the courage. All of a sudden, Fan Wanner stopped and turned her gaze to the distance, and a concerned look appeared on her face as she said, "The reason why I brought this up is because I want to talk to you about something that's always befuddled me." "Go ahead," Wei Yan prompted in an intrigued manner. Fan Wanner began massaging her own glabella, and Wei Yan asked in a concerned voice, "What's wrong? Did that white-robed swordsman do something to you?" Fan Wanner shook her head with a smile, then asked, "Your Highness, have you ever heard of otherworldly immortals from your master?" "My master is an unrefined martial artist, and he never mentions such topics," Wei Yan replied with a smile. "He detests scholars and denounces them as a bunch of cowards with no balls. Whenever I have a chat with my master, if I use any idioms or any form of what he considers to be refined language, then I'll be sure to receive a beating. Hence, I could only ever read about otherworldly immortals in poems and scriptures." Seeing as Wei Yan had no useful information to offer, Fan Wanner didn't dwell on this topic, and she turned her gaze to the distance again as she changed the subject and asked, "Your Highness, do you ever get the feeling that when we experience something, go to a place or meet a person, that it feels a little familiar, even though those should be first-time experiences?" "I have had that feeling before," Wei Yan replied with a nod, following which he asked with an amused smile, "Could it be that you believe in the Buddhist concept of reincarnation, celestial maiden Fan?" Fan Wanner shook her head in response. On this particular night, there were 7 or 8 people standing on Bull Mountain, one of whom was the childlike Yu Zheni, who was looking out at the capital city in the distance with a solemn look on his face. There was also the disheveled drunkard who had even pawned his sword to the woman running the wine shop, and his name was Lu Feng. Imperial Preceptor Zhong Qiu of Southern Garden Nation was also present. He was a thin and serious-looking man with a scholarly demeanor, and it was hard to imagine that he was the leading figure among the 4 grandmasters. Yu Zheni's voice was just as tender as his appearance suggested it would be, and he said, "It looks like we're going to have to kill an additional person outside of Old Demon Ding, Zhou Fei, Feng Qingbai, and Tong Qingqing. It's not going to be me, is it?" Lu Feng asked in a self-deprecating voice, and he was met with a cold glare from Zhong Qiu. An exasperated look appeared on Lu Feng's face as he asked, "So I'm not even allowed to crack jokes now?" Aside from these 3, there were also some figures on the mountain summit that definitely shouldn't have appeared here. All of them were either among the upper 10 elites, or were martial arts masters of the same caliber as Wei Yan's master. On this particular night, righteous and evil forces were coming together for a joint cause. Yu Zheni was staring intently at a certain spot in the capital city as he said in a quiet voice, "Lu Feng, go and take care of that outsider. As for whether you work together to kill him or kill him on your own, I don't care, but failure is not an option. Bring that person's head to me within 3 days, and just like always, the one who kills him gets to keep all of his possessions." Lu Feng rubbed the back of his own head as he heaved a faint sigh, while a burst of eager cackling rang out in the distance. Instead of returning to his residence, Chan Ping'an was roaming the capital city at night like a lost spirit, and as he did so, he snuck into the scripture library of a well-educated clan and began to read through the books there. He departed before daybreak, then went to eavesdrop on the lessons being delivered at the capital city's Imperial Academy. Only at noon did he return to Champion Scholar Alley, and he intentionally avoided the residence that the old man with the Ding surname and Zhou Shi were staying in,